Victoria Hale had built an empire on control, until the night she lost it all to ice, darkness, and the man whose life she'd destroyed. Stranded in a blizzard with hypothermia creeping through her veins, the tech CEO, who once fired Ethan Cole with a single signature, now stood shivering at his cabin door, her designer heels sinking into snow, her pride the only thing keeping her upright. He could slam the door. He should slam the door. Instead, he stepped aside, and she stumbled into the warmth of the home she'd stolen from him. What happened next would change everything they thought they knew about power, survival, and the cost of being human. If you want to see how a single storm can tear down walls built over years, stay with me until the end. And when you're done, hit that like button and drop a comment with your city. I want to see how far this story travels. The first rule of empire building Victoria Hale had learned long ago was simple. Never let them see you need anything. Not approval, not affection, and certainly not help. She'd carved Hale Technologies from nothing into a billion-dollar fortress on that principle alone. Every decision sharpened to a razor's edge, every quarter driving toward the same relentless goal. More. More revenue, more market share, more proof that she'd earned her place at tables where women like her were still considered guests. The second rule, equally important, was never to look back, especially not at the faces of people she'd had to remove from her path. Which was why, as her Tesla skidded on black ice for the third time in 10 minutes, Victoria refused to acknowledge the irony of where she was headed. The mountain retreat had been a last-minute decision, a weekend carved out of her calendar because her assistant had started using words like burnout and mandatory rest. The route through the Cascades was supposed to save her 40 minutes. The weather report had called for light snow. Neither assumption had survived contact with reality. Rerouting, her car's navigation system announced with infuriating calm as she fought the wheel through another drift. Turn left in 0.3 miles. There is no left, Victoria snapped at the dashboard, her knuckles white against the leather steering wheel. Through the windshield, the world had contracted to a tunnel of white chaos, her headlights barely penetrating the wall of snow that seemed to attack from every direction at once. The temperature display read 14 degrees. She'd passed the last visible road sign 20 minutes ago. Her phone had lost signal 30 minutes before that. The Tesla lurched again, and this time the wheels found nothing but air beneath them for one sickening moment before slamming back down. The impact sent her laptop bag flying from the passenger seat, scattering quarterly reports across the floor. Victoria's breath came sharp and fast now, her heart hammering against her ribs with something she absolutely refused to name as fear. CEOs didn't feel fear. They assessed risks and made decisions. The decision she made 10 seconds later to pull over before the car made it for her would have felt wise if she'd had any idea where over actually was. The Tesla rolled to a stop in what might have been a shoulder or might have been a ditch. Hard to tell when the entire world looked like the inside of a snow globe someone had shaken too hard. Victoria sat for a moment, hands still gripped on the wheel, breathing through her nose the way her executive coach had taught her. Assess, adapt, act. She reached for her phone, knowing what she'd find. No signal, battery at 15%, because she'd forgotten to charge it last night while reviewing the merger documents. Her heated seats were still running. The car had 3/4 of a charge. She could wait out the storm right here. Except the storm showed no signs of stopping, and the temperature outside was still dropping. The heated seats would drain the battery. A dead battery meant no heat. No heat in 14-degree weather meant... Victoria cut off that thought before it could complete itself. She was wearing a Burberry coat over a silk blouse and wool slacks, neither designed for actual winter survival. Her boots were Italian leather, with heels that cost more than some people's monthly rent, and about as practical in snow as stilts would be. In the back seat, her weekend bag contained exactly 3 things useful for this situation: a cashmere sweater, a pair of designer jeans, and a phone charger that required the outlet she no longer trusted her battery to power. "You're fine," she said aloud, her voice steady in the car's cocoon of artificial warmth. "You've navigated hostile takeovers. You've rebuilt a company from the ground up. You can handle weather." The wind answered by slamming into the Tesla hard enough to rock it on its suspension. Victoria pulled out her phone one more time, opened the map app, and watched it search uselessly for a signal that wouldn't come. But before the app gave up entirely, it had cached one crucial detail. According to the last GPS ping, there was a structure zero point 0.4 miles northeast of her current position. No label, no details, just a small gray square that indicated something human-made existed in that direction. 0. 0.4 miles. 15 minutes in good weather. Maybe 30 in this mess. If she didn't freeze first. She looked down at her coat, her ridiculous boots, her manicured hands that hadn't done real manual labor in 15 years. Then she looked at the temperature reading again, now 13 degrees and falling. Assessment complete. Decision made. Victoria Hale opened the car door and stepped into the storm. The cold hit like a physical blow, stealing her breath and replacing it with knives. Snow immediately found every gap in her designer armor, collar, cuffs, the space between her coat and her slacks. The wind didn't just blow, it attacked, shoving her sideways the moment her heels touched the ground. She grabbed the car door for balance, already regretting every decision that had led to this moment. But Victoria Hale hadn't built an empire by second-guessing herself. She pulled her coat tighter, activated her phone's compass app for the 3 seconds before the battery-saving mode kicked in, fixed the northeast direction in her mind, and started walking. The first 50 yards taught her that Burberry coats were designed for fashion, not function. The wind cut through the wool like it wasn't there, and her silk blouse underneath provided exactly zero insulation. Her slacks were soaked through within minutes, the wet fabric clinging to her legs and pulling heat from her body with terrifying efficiency. The second 50 yards taught her that 3-inch heels were actively dangerous in snow. She fell twice, catching herself on her hands both times, feeling ice bite into her palms through her leather gloves. The second time, she stayed down for a moment, kneeling in the drift, breathing hard through the pain. "Get up," she told herself. "You don't have the luxury of staying down." She got up. The third 50 yards taught her what real cold felt like. Not the intellectual knowledge that it was 14 degrees, but the actual feeling of her body beginning to shut down piece by piece. Her fingers went numb first, even inside the gloves. Then her toes, trapped in boots that might as well have been made of paper for all the protection they offered. Her face hurt, actually hurt, like someone was pressing needles into her skin. By the time she'd covered what she desperately hoped was 0.4 miles, Victoria couldn't feel her hands at all. Her breathing came in ragged gasps that burned her lungs. Snow had worked its way down her collar, melting against her skin before refreezing. Her slacks were frozen stiff, making each step harder than the last. And then, through the curtain of white, she saw it, the dark outline of a structure. Small, barely more than a shadow, but real. Human-made. Shelter. Victoria tried to run and discovered her legs wouldn't cooperate anymore. The best she could manage was a stumbling fast walk, her frozen feet barely lifting with each step. The structure resolved itself into a cabin, small, rustic, smoke rising from a chimney that meant warmth, that meant survival. She made it to the porch, grabbed the railing with hands that couldn't feel whether they'd actually gripped anything, and pulled herself up the 3 steps through sheer force of will. The door was right there. Safety was right there. Victoria Hale, CEO of Hale Technologies, raised her numb hand and knocked. The door opened, spilling golden light and blessed warmth into the frozen darkness. "Please," Victoria managed through chattering teeth. "I need—" She looked up into the face of the man in the doorway, and the words died in her throat. Ethan Cole stared back at her, his expression shifting from concern to recognition to something harder in the space of a heartbeat. He was older than she remembered, lines around his eyes that hadn't been there 6 months ago, silver threading through his dark hair at the temples. He wore a flannel shirt and jeans, both well worn. No shoes, just thick wool socks. Behind him, she could see a fire burning in a stone fireplace, warm light painting everything gold. "Ms. Hale," he said, his voice carefully neutral. Not cold, not warm, just controlled. "Ethan." His name came out as barely more than a whisper. "I didn't know. My car, the storm. You're freezing." He said it like a diagnosis, not a comfort. But he stepped back, opening the door wider. "Get inside before you die on my porch." That would be complicated to explain. It wasn't kindness exactly, but it was shelter, and right now Victoria would take what she could get. She stumbled across the threshold, her frozen boots leaving wet tracks on hardwood floors. The warmth of the cabin hit her like a wall, and with it came pain, the kind of burning pins and needles agony that meant feeling was returning to extremities that had gotten too cold. Ethan closed the door behind her, shutting out the storm. In the sudden quiet, Victoria could hear the crackle of the fire, the howl of wind outside, and her own ragged breathing. She stood there, dripping and shaking, facing the man she'd fired with a form letter and a security escort. "How far did you walk?" he asked, still in that carefully controlled voice. "0.4 miles. Maybe, I'm not sure." "In that?" He gestured toward her coat, her boots, her completely inadequate clothing. "Jesus, sit down before you fall down." He guided her toward a chair near the fireplace, not touching her, but staying close enough to catch her if her legs gave out. They almost did. Victoria collapsed into the chair, and the warmth from the fire washed over her like a blessing and a curse. Her hands burned, her feet burned. Her face felt like it was being stabbed by 1,000 tiny needles. "I need to check you for frostbite," Ethan said, already kneeling in front of her. "And hypothermia. Do you consent to me touching your hands and feet?" The formality of the question, the careful distance he was maintaining even now, cut deeper than the cold had. But Victoria nodded because she was still practical enough to know she needed help. Ethan pulled off her gloves first, his movements gentle despite everything. Her hands were bone white, the fingers stiff. He cupped them between his palms, his hands rough with calluses she didn't remember, warm with life. "Can you feel this?" he asked. "It hurts." "Good. Pain means the tissue isn't dead." He released her hands carefully and moved to her boots. "These need to come off. The leather is wet, which means it's pulling heat from your feet. I'm going to unlace them, okay?" Victoria wanted to tell him she could do it herself, but her hands were shaking too hard to manage the laces. She watched as Ethan worked each boot free with practiced efficiency, then peeled off her soaked socks. Her feet were the same bone white as her hands, the toes stiff and unresponsive. "Wiggle your toes," he instructed. She tried. They barely moved, but they moved. "Better than I was afraid of," Ethan muttered, more to himself than to her. He stood, walked to a closet, and returned with a heavy wool blanket. "Your clothes are soaked. You need to get out of them." Victoria's head snapped up. "Excuse me?" "You're wet, which means you're going to keep losing heat no matter how close to the fire you sit." His voice remained clinical, professional. "Wet clothes in this temperature will kill you as surely as staying outside would have. You need to get into dry clothes, or at least wrap up in something that will hold your body heat." "I'm not," Victoria started, then stopped, because she could feel him watching her, evaluating her exactly the way she used to evaluate problems in board meetings. Cost versus benefit. Pride versus survival. "I'll turn around," Ethan said quietly. "Take off everything that's wet. Wrap yourself in the blanket. There's a bathroom through that door if you'd prefer privacy, but honestly, I don't trust your legs to get you there safely right now." The humiliation of it settled over Victoria like another layer of cold. 6 months ago, she'd sat in her corner office on the 52nd floor and signed the termination order that ended this man's career. She'd never even looked up from the paperwork. And now she was supposed to strip down to nothing in his cabin, wrapped in his blanket, dependent on his charity. "I can keep my clothes on," she said, hearing the shake in her own voice and hating it. "You can." Ethan moved toward the kitchen, giving her space. "And in about 20 minutes, when your core temperature drops another degree, you'll slip into severe hypothermia. You'll stop shivering, start feeling warm actually, get confused, maybe combative, then unconscious, then dead. It's your choice, Ms. Hale. It's always been your choice." The emphasis on the last word wasn't lost on Victoria. She closed her eyes, feeling the truth of his assessment in the violent shaking of her body, in the sluggish way her thoughts were moving. She was a practical woman. She made practical decisions. This was the most impractical position she'd ever been in. "Turn around," she whispered. Ethan turned his back without another word, facing the kitchen counter. Victoria watched him for a moment, checking to see if he'd sneak a glance, but his shoulders remained square, his head forward. Whatever else he might feel about having her here, he wasn't going to humiliate her. She peeled the wet coat off first, her fingers clumsy with cold and shock. Then the blouse, silk clinging to her skin, buttons refusing to cooperate. The slacks came next, frozen stiff and heavy with moisture. Then the rest, until she sat there in nothing but goosebumps and shame, every expensive piece of armor she'd worn reduced to a sodden pile on the floor. Victoria grabbed the blanket and wrapped it around herself, pulling it tight. It was thick and heavy, smelling faintly of wood smoke and something else. Cedar, maybe. Clean, warm, safe. "Okay," she said, her voice small in the quiet cabin. Ethan turned around, and if he felt anything about seeing Victoria Hale reduced to this, wrapped in a blanket by his fire, shivering and helpless, his face didn't show it. He moved to the pile of wet clothes and began spreading them near the hearth, not too close to scorch, but close enough to dry. "There's tea," he said, straightening up. "Hot. You need to warm up from the inside, too. Can you hold a cup?" Victoria looked at her shaking hands. "I think so." He disappeared into the kitchen and returned with a heavy ceramic mug, steam rising from it. Victoria wrapped both hands around it, feeling the heat seep into her palms. The first sip burned her tongue, but the warmth spreading down her throat and into her chest felt like returning to life. Ethan settled into the chair across from her, maintaining that careful distance. In the firelight, she could see him more clearly now. He looked good. Better than he had in the office, actually. The lines around his eyes weren't just age. They were the kind that came from smiling, from squinting into sunshine. His hands, wrapped around his own mug, were the hands of someone who built things, fixed things, real things, not just spreadsheets and profit margins. "What are you doing up here?" Victoria asked, then immediately regretted the question. It wasn't her business. She'd forfeited the right to know anything about Ethan Cole's life 6 months ago. "I live here," he said simply. "Have for 3 months now." 3 months? So you moved here after— She couldn't finish the sentence. "After you fired me?" "Yeah." No bitterness in his voice, just fact. "Couldn't afford the city anymore. This place belonged to my grandfather. He left it to me. Figured it was time to use it." Victoria took another sip of tea, using the moment to study the cabin. It was small but well maintained, everything in its place. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with technical manuals and what looked like children's books. A small kitchen occupied one corner. Through an open doorway, she could see what looked like a bedroom. "You live here alone?" she asked. Ethan's expression shifted slightly, not quite hardening, but closing off. "No." Before Victoria could ask what that meant, a small voice called from the bedroom. "Daddy, I heard talking." Ethan was on his feet immediately. "It's okay, sweetheart. Go back to sleep." But the door opened anyway, and a little girl emerged, rubbing her eyes. She couldn't have been more than 6, wearing dinosaur pajamas and holding a stuffed rabbit. When she saw Victoria, she stopped, suddenly shy. "Who's that?" the girl whispered to Ethan. He crouched down to her level, one hand gentle on her shoulder. "This is Ms. Hale. She got caught in the storm and needed help. She's going to stay here tonight until it's safe to leave." The girl studied Victoria with the frank, assessing stare that only children could pull off. "She's cold." "Very cold," Ethan agreed. "But she's warming up now. Can you say hello?" "Hello," the girl said obediently. "I'm Sophie." "Hello, Sophie." Victoria managed to smile, though her face still felt stiff with cold. "Thank you for sharing your home with me." Sophie nodded seriously, then looked up at Ethan. "Can she have my extra blanket? The purple one Grandma made?" Something in Ethan's expression softened. "That's very kind of you, sweetheart. Why don't you go get it?" Sophie scampered back into the bedroom, returning moments later with a hand-knitted purple blanket that she shyly offered to Victoria. Victoria took it, feeling the weight of the gesture. This child offering comfort to a stranger, not knowing that the stranger was the reason her father had lost his job, had to move to this isolated cabin, had to rebuild his entire life. "Thank you," Victoria said, her voice catching slightly. "This is beautiful." Sophie beamed, then yawned wide enough to show all her baby teeth. Ethan scooped her up gently. "Back to bed, monster. It's way past your bedtime." "Will the snow lady still be here in the morning?" Sophie asked, her head already drooping against Ethan's shoulder. "Probably," Ethan said. The storm's not going anywhere tonight. He carried his daughter back to the bedroom, and Victoria could hear him tucking her in, his voice low and gentle as he said goodnight. When he returned, he settled back into his chair, and the silence that fell between them was heavy with everything they weren't saying. "I didn't know you had a daughter," Victoria finally said. "You never asked." Simple, factual, true. "In my office that day. You tried to tell me something about circumstances. I didn't let you finish." "No, you didn't?" Ethan stared into the fire. "You had a quota to meet, 20% reduction in workforce. I was just a number on your spreadsheet." "That's not—" Victoria stopped because that was exactly what it had been. 20%. The board had demanded it. The investors had demanded it. Cut the fat, increase efficiency, show growth in the next quarter, or watch the stock price tank. She'd spent 2 weeks reviewing personnel files, making decisions about lives and livelihoods like they were line items in a budget, which they were, which they had to be. That was business. Except business was now sitting across from her, holding a cup of tea in work-roughened hands with a 6-year-old daughter sleeping in the next room. "You were one of my best engineers," Victoria said quietly. "Your performance reviews were excellent. I didn't want to let you go." "But you did." "I had to." "No." Ethan looked at her directly now, and she saw something in his eyes she couldn't quite name. Not anger, not resentment, something sadder. "You chose to. There's a difference." Victoria opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again. Because he was right. She'd had options. She could have fought harder with the board, could have cut her own salary, reduced executive bonuses, found other ways to trim the budget. She'd chosen the path of least resistance, the one that protected her position and her priorities, the one that ended with Ethan Cole packing his desk in a cardboard box while security waited to escort him out. "I'm sorry," she said, and the words felt both inadequate and necessary. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry." Ethan was quiet for a long moment, the fire crackling between them. "You know what the hardest part was?" he finally said. "Not the job. I mean, yeah, that sucked. But I'm an engineer, I can find work. The hardest part was telling Sophie why we had to leave her school, her friends, the only home she'd ever known. She's 6. She doesn't understand market forces or quarterly reports. She just knew that Daddy didn't have a job anymore, and we had to move somewhere small and far away from everything she loved." Each word landed like a stone in Victoria's chest. She clutched the purple blanket, hand-knitted by a grandmother for a little girl who'd lost her home, and felt the full weight of her decisions in a way that no board meeting had ever forced her to feel them. "How did you explain it to her?" Victoria asked quietly. "I told her the truth, that sometimes people make choices that hurt other people, and we can't control what others choose. We can only control how we respond." Ethan took a long drink of his tea. "I told her we'd figure it out together, build a new life, that we'd be okay." "Are you? Okay?" He looked around the cabin, at the warm fire, the books, the closed door behind which his daughter slept safe and warm. "We're getting there. I do remote consulting work now, freelance. It's not the same, but it pays enough. Sophie likes it here, says the trees are magic." Victoria smiled despite everything. "Are they?" "She insists they are. Who am I to argue with a 6-year-old? Something in Ethan's expression eased slightly, though the distance between them remained. "I'm teaching her to code. She's already better at it than half the junior developers I used to supervise." "She has your aptitude, then." "She has her mother's stubbornness and my tendency to solve problems the hard way." Ethan's smile faded. "Sophie's mom died 2 years ago, car accident. It was just us even before I lost the job." The information hit Victoria like a physical blow. Single father, recently widowed, struggling to support his daughter, and she'd fired him with a form letter, never once bothering to look beyond the personnel file, beyond the spreadsheet. "Ethan, She didn't know how to finish that sentence. Sorry was too small. Any explanation she offered would sound like an excuse. So she simply said, "I didn't know." "Like I said, you never asked." No accusation in his voice, just weariness. "It's late. You should get some rest. You can have the couch. I'll bring you some actual clothes in the morning, once yours are dry enough to handle." He stood, and Victoria realized she was being dismissed, gently, politely, but dismissed nonetheless. Ethan grabbed a pillow and another blanket from a closet, set them on the couch, then turned to go. Ethan. Victoria stopped him with his name. He paused, but didn't turn around. Thank you for letting me in. You didn't have to. Now he did turn, and something in his expression was unreadable in the firelight. I know, but that's the difference between us, Ms. Hale. When you were in a position to make a choice about me, you chose the easy path. When I was in that position tonight, I chose the human one. He walked to his bedroom and closed the door quietly behind him, leaving Victoria alone with the fire and her thoughts, and the terrible understanding that she'd built an empire on efficiency and lost something essential in the process. She pulled Sophie's purple blanket tighter around her shoulders and stared into the flames, listening to the storm rage outside, and wondered if anything would look the same when morning came. Victoria woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of a child's laughter, both so foreign to her usual mornings that for a disorienting moment she couldn't remember where she was. Then the events of the previous night came rushing back. The storm, the walk, the humiliation of stripping down in front of the man she'd fired. She sat up on the couch, Sophie's purple blanket pooling around her waist, and found herself still wrapped in the larger wool blanket Ethan had given her. Through the window, dawn was breaking over a world transformed into white silence. The storm had passed, leaving behind drifts that reached halfway up the cabin's windows. The morning light caught the snow and threw it back in 1,000 shades of silver and blue. Good morning! Ethan's voice came from the kitchen, careful and neutral as it had been last night. He was dressed in fresh clothes, a different flannel, dark jeans, his hair still damp from a shower. Coffee's ready if you want some. Your clothes are dry. I left them on the chair. Victoria looked and found her things folded neatly, no longer frozen stiff, but clearly worse for wear. The Burberry coat that had cost $3,000 looked like something pulled from a donation bin. Her silk blouse was wrinkled beyond recognition. The boots were stiff and salt-stained. Thank you, she managed, her voice rough with sleep, for drying them. Basic decency. He poured coffee into 2 mugs, added cream to one without asking if she took it. Victoria realized he must have remembered from the office, from the hundreds of staff meetings where she'd nursed identical cups. The fact that he'd remembered such a small detail about her after everything felt like both a gift and an indictment. Sophie appeared from the bedroom, her hair in lopsided pigtails that Ethan had clearly attempted with limited success. She climbed into a chair at the small kitchen table and smiled at Victoria with the open friendliness of a child who hadn't yet learned that some people didn't deserve kindness. Daddy says you're going to have breakfast with us, Sophie announced. We're having pancakes. I get to crack the eggs. If you're careful, Ethan added, pulling ingredients from the refrigerator. Last time you decorated the floor more than the bowl. That was an accident, Sophie protested, but she was grinning. Victoria watched them move around each other with the practiced ease of a team that had been operating together for years. Ethan handed Sophie the eggs, supervised her careful cracking, praised her when she got them in the bowl with only minimal shell fragments. Sophie chatted about the snow, about whether the trees were happy to have blankets, about a fort she wanted to build if Daddy said it was safe. It was so completely outside Victoria's experience that she felt like an anthropologist observing an alien culture. Her own mornings were coffee grabbed from the machine in her kitchen while she reviewed emails, conference calls taken while her driver navigated traffic. Breakfast usually skipped entirely in favor of an earlier start at the office. Miss Hale? Sophie's voice pulled her back to the present. Do you like chocolate chips or blueberries? Victoria realized she didn't remember the last time she'd eaten actual pancakes. Blueberries, I think. Good choice. Ethan was already mixing batter, his movements efficient and practiced. Sophie thinks chocolate chips are a breakfast food. I'm trying to maintain some nutritional standards. Chocolate is made from beans, Sophie argued with the logic of a 6-year-old. Beans are vegetables. That's not how it works, monster. It should be. Despite everything, the awkwardness of the situation, the weight of guilt sitting in her chest, the knowledge that she was intruding on a life she'd nearly destroyed, Victoria found herself smiling. There was something magnetic about watching them, this small unit of 2 who'd learned to be enough for each other. Ethan poured batter onto the griddle, and soon the cabin filled with the smell of cooking pancakes. He worked quickly, producing a stack that he divided between 3 plates. Sophie's got a small handful of chocolate chips arranged in a smiley face on top, which made her squeal with delight. "Thank you for letting me stay," Victoria said as they settled around the small table. It felt important to acknowledge it, to not pretend this was normal. "Couldn't exactly throw you back in the snow," Ethan replied, passing the syrup. "That would have been murder, and I've got enough problems without adding a felony charge." The dark humor surprised a genuine laugh out of Victoria. Sophie giggled too, though she probably didn't understand the joke. They ate in a silence that was almost comfortable, broken only by Sophie's running commentary on the quality of her pancakes and her plans for the snow fort. Victoria found herself watching Ethan when she thought he wouldn't notice, the way he automatically cut Sophie's pancakes into smaller pieces, the way he listened to her rambling stories with complete attention, the way he'd built a life out of the wreckage she'd created. "Your car's gonna need digging out," Ethan said eventually, his fork pushing blueberries around his plate. "Probably buried under 2 feet of snow by now. And the roads won't be plowed until this afternoon at the earliest. They always do the main highway first, then work their way out to the access roads. So I'm stuck here." Victoria meant it as an observation, not a complaint, but it still came out wrong somehow. "Unless you want to try walking back in those boots," Ethan gestured toward her expensive, impractical footwear. "I wouldn't recommend it." "I'll stay then, if that's all right." "Do I have a choice?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning. Victoria set down her fork carefully. "Of course you do. I can try to make it back to my car, wait there and freeze to death or run out of battery." Ethan shook his head. "I'm not going to let that happen, Ms. Hale, even if part of me wants to watch you struggle the way I struggled after you fired me." Sophie's head swiveled between them, picking up on the tension even if she didn't understand it. "Are you fighting?" "No, sweetheart." Ethan's voice immediately gentled. "We're just talking about grown-up stuff. Why don't you go get your coloring books? You can show Ms. Hale your dinosaur pictures." Sophie scrambled down from her chair and ran to her room, leaving the two adults alone with the weight of Ethan's words settling between them. "I wouldn't blame you," Victoria said quietly, "for wanting me to struggle. I deserve it. Maybe. But Sophie doesn't deserve to watch me be cruel to someone who needs help. I'm trying to teach her that we don't kick people when they're down, even if they've kicked us first." Ethan picked up his coffee mug, cradling it in both hands. "Even if every part of me wants to." The honesty of it stole Victoria's breath. She'd expected anger or bitterness, or worse, the kind of obsequious gratitude that came from people who thought they still needed something from her. But Ethan was giving her something more difficult, the truth, unvarnished and direct. "I didn't know about Sophie," Victoria said, knowing it was inadequate but needing to say it anyway. "About your wife, about any of it. That's not an excuse. I should have known. I should have asked." "Why would you?" Ethan's eyes met hers across the table. "I was just employee number 347 in the engineering department, one of 20% you needed to cut to make your numbers look good for the quarterly report." "It wasn't like that, wasn't it?" He leaned back in his chair, and Victoria saw the careful control in his posture, the way he was keeping his emotions locked down tight. "Tell me, Ms. Hale, did you know anything about the people you fired that day? Their names, their families, what they'd contributed to the company?" Victoria wanted to lie, to claim she'd agonized over every decision, but they'd already been through too much for dishonesty. "No. I knew your performance metrics, your salary, your department. That's what I based the decision on." "Metrics." Ethan laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You want to know what my metrics didn't show? That I'd just spent 6 months taking care of my dying wife while trying to keep my productivity up so I wouldn't lose my job. That I was working from the hospital, from hospice, from home at 3 in the morning after Sophie finally fell asleep crying for her mother. My metrics probably did drop. How could they not?" Each word hit Victoria like a physical blow. She'd reviewed those files, seen the slight dip in Ethan's output over the previous quarters, used it as justification for putting his name on the list. Efficient, data-driven, completely blind to the human being behind the numbers. "I'm sorry," she whispered, knowing the words were worthless but offering them anyway. "Ethan, I'm so sorry." "Are you? Or are you just sorry you got caught in a storm and had to face the consequences of your decisions?" He stood abruptly, gathering the plates. There's a difference. Before Victoria could respond, Sophie bounded back into the room with an armful of coloring books and a container of crayons. She dumped them on the table with the enthusiasm of someone who'd found the perfect solution to awkward adult tension. Look, this is a T-Rex, and this is a Triceratops, and this one is a pterodactyl, even though Daddy says that's not technically a dinosaur. Sophie flipped through the pages, showing off her work with pride. Some of the pictures were carefully colored inside the lines. Others were chaotic explosions of color that bore only passing resemblance to the printed outlines. "These are beautiful," Victoria said, and meant it. There was something joyful about the abandon in some of the pictures, the way Sophie had clearly decided that a purple stegosaurus was perfectly acceptable. "Do you want to color with me?" Sophie pushed a blank page in the crayon container toward Victoria. "You can do this Brachiosaurus. I'll do the Velociraptor." Victoria looked down at the coloring book, something she hadn't touched since she was probably Sophie's age, and then up at Ethan, who was watching from the kitchen with an unreadable expression. "I don't want to intrude," Victoria said. "You're already here." Ethan dried his hands on a dish towel. "Might as well make yourself useful. Fair warning, Sophie's very particular about staying in the lines." "Only for some dinosaurs," Sophie corrected seriously. "The fierce ones can be messy. The plant eaters have to be neat. Those are the rules." "I see." Victoria picked up a green crayon, studying the outline of the long-necked dinosaur. "And Brachiosaurus was a plant eater?" "The biggest one." Sophie had already started on her Velociraptor, her tongue sticking out slightly in concentration. "They ate leaves from really tall trees, Daddy told me." Victoria began coloring, her movements careful and precise. She found herself falling into a rhythm, the quiet scratch of crayon on paper, Sophie's soft humming, the crackle of the fire Ethan was rebuilding in the living room. It should have been awkward, this forced domesticity with the man whose life she'd upended, but somehow it wasn't. Or maybe it was, and she was just too tired to maintain her usual walls. "You're really good at staying in the lines," Sophie observed after a few minutes. "Daddy's terrible at it. He says his hands are too big for coloring." "My hands are perfectly sized," Ethan called from the living room. "The crayons are just poorly designed." "That's what he always says," Sophie confided to Victoria in a stage whisper. "But I think he just doesn't try hard enough." Victoria surprised herself by laughing, a real laugh, not the polite corporate chuckle she'd perfected for board meetings. "Maybe we all need practice." They colored in companionable silence for a while. Victoria found herself relaxing into it, her mind quieting in a way it rarely did. No emails demanding responses, no meetings to prepare for, no decisions that would affect hundreds of lives. Just a green crayon and a Brachiosaurus and a 6-year-old girl who didn't know she should hate the woman sitting across from her. "Miss Hale?" Sophie's voice was thoughtful. "Why were you out in the storm by yourself?" "I was trying to get to a cabin in the mountains, for a weekend away from work." "Don't you have friends to go with you?" The question, innocent and direct in the way only children could manage, hit harder than it should have. Victoria paused mid-stroke, the green crayon hovering over the page. "I don't, actually. I work a lot. I don't have much time for friends." "That's sad." Sophie stated it as simple fact, without judgment. "Everyone needs friends. Daddy says friends are important, even when they're annoying." "Sophie," Ethan's voice held a warning note. "What? You do say that? You said it about Uncle Mike when he ate all the good cereal." Despite himself, Ethan smiled. "Uncle Mike is your godfather, and yes, he's very annoying. But he's also family, which means we love him even when he steals the frosted flakes." Victoria watched this exchange, feeling the ache of something she couldn't quite name. When was the last time she'd had a conversation like this? Easy and real, about nothing and everything at once? She had business associates, board members, people she networked with at industry events. But friends, people who would drive through a storm to check on her, who knew how she took her coffee without asking. She had no one. The realization settled over her like the snow outside. Quiet, cold, complete. "Your Brachiosaurus is really pretty," Sophie said, examining Victoria's work. "You should sign it. That's what real artists do." Victoria picked up a crayon and signed her name in the corner of the page, feeling ridiculous and strangely touched at the same time. Sophie carefully tore the page from the book and held it up. "Daddy, can we keep this one? For the refrigerator?" Ethan had moved to the window, checking the depth of the snow. He turned at Sophie's question, his eyes going from his daughter's hopeful face to the coloring page to Victoria. "Sure, monster, we can keep it." Sophie beamed and ran to stick the picture on the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a dinosaur egg. Victoria's careful coloring now hung next to Sophie's wilder creations, her name in the corner like she was part of this small family's collection of memories. It shouldn't have meant anything, it was just a coloring page. But Victoria found her throat tight with unexpected emotion. Ethan returned to the table, his expression thoughtful. "The snow's deep, but it stopped falling. I need to dig out the path to the woodshed. Make sure we're stocked up. You're welcome to stay inside where it's warm." "I can help." The words were out before Victoria could think them through. "In those?" Ethan gestured at her designer boots. "I have—" Victoria trailed off because she didn't have anything appropriate. Her weekend bag contained clothes meant for a luxury cabin with heated floors and room service, not actual manual labor in sub-zero temperatures. "I've got spare boots and a coat," Ethan said after a moment. "They'll be too big, but better than what you've got, if you actually want to help." "I do." Victoria meant it. She was tired of sitting, of being helpless, of watching Ethan take care of everything while she contributed nothing. 10 minutes later, she found herself bundled in borrowed gear that swallowed her frame. Ethan's spare work boots, an old parka that must have belonged to his grandfather, thick gloves that made her hands look cartoonish. Sophie thought it was hilarious. "You look like a marshmallow," the little girl declared, giggling. "I feel like one," Victoria admitted, testing her movement in the bulky coat. But she was warm, which was more than she could say for her own expensive gear. Ethan handed her a shovel, took one for himself, and they stepped out into the transformed world. The cold hit immediately, but this time Victoria was prepared for it. The borrowed gear might not be fashionable, but it was functional in a way her designer clothes had never been. "We'll start with the path to the shed," Ethan said, already moving snow with efficient, practiced movements. "Then the steps. Then we'll see about digging out your car." Victoria pushed her shovel into the snow and immediately understood why Ethan's shoulders were so much broader than she remembered. This was real work, the kind that made muscles burn and breath come hard. She'd spent years in climate-controlled gyms with personal trainers, but this was different. This was work with purpose, each shovelful revealing another foot of path. They worked in silence for a while, falling into a rhythm. Ethan moved with the ease of someone who'd done this 100 times. Victoria struggled but persisted, determined not to be useless. Sweat began to gather under the heavy coat despite the cold. Her arms ached. Her back protested. She kept going. "You don't have to prove anything," Ethan said eventually, pausing to wipe his forehead. "You're a CEO, not a laborer. No one expects you to be good at this." "Maybe I'm not trying to prove anything." Victoria leaned on her shovel, breathing hard. "Maybe I just want to actually contribute instead of being a burden." "Is that what you think you are? A burden? Aren't I?" She gestured around at the cabin, at the extra work her presence created. "You didn't ask for me to show up. You didn't ask for any of this." Ethan was quiet for a moment, his breath steaming in the cold air. "No, I didn't. But life doesn't always ask permission. You showed up freezing and desperate, and I let you in. That was my choice. What happens next? That's on both of us." Victoria wanted to ask what he meant by that, but Sophie appeared at the window, waving at them with both hands. Ethan waved back, his entire demeanor softening. The contrast between the man facing Victoria and the man responding to his daughter was stark. "She's wonderful," Victoria said quietly. "You're doing an amazing job with her." "I'm doing my best. Some days that feels like enough. Other days—" Ethan trailed off, returning to his shoveling with perhaps more force than necessary. "Other days I wonder if she deserves better than a father who lost his job and had to move her away from everything she knew. She deserves a father who loves her, who shows up for her, who makes her pancakes with chocolate chip smiley faces even though he thinks it's not nutritious." Victoria moved more snow, finding her rhythm again. "That seems pretty close to enough." They worked their way through the path to the shed, then cleared the steps. The sun climbed higher, making the snow sparkle like diamonds. It was beautiful in a way that Victoria rarely took time to notice. Nature doing its thing regardless of quarterly reports or stock prices or any human concern. When they finally stopped for a break, both breathing hard, Victoria found herself looking at the cabin with new eyes. It was small and rustic, and probably drafty in places. Nothing like her penthouse apartment with its floor-to-ceiling windows and designer furniture. But smoke curled from the chimney, and a little girl's face was pressed against the glass, and someone inside had taped a coloring page of a brachiosaurus to the refrigerator. It looked like a home, an actual home, not just a place to sleep between work sessions. "What are you thinking?" Ethan asked, following her gaze. "That I don't have anything like this," Victoria admitted. "I have a penthouse worth $3 million, and it feels emptier than this cabin." "Money doesn't buy everything." "No, it doesn't." She turned to face him directly. "You asked if I was really sorry, or just sorry I got caught. I've been thinking about that. The truth is, I don't know. I want to say I would have felt guilty eventually, that I would have realized what I'd done. But I don't know if that's true. I might have just moved on to the next decision, the next quarter, the next goal." Ethan studied her, his expression unreadable. "At least you're honest about it." "I'm trying to be. For the first time in a long time, I'm trying to see things clearly instead of through the filter of what makes good business sense." Victoria pulled off her gloves, her hands red with cold and effort. "I don't like what I see." "So change it." "It's not that simple." "Isn't it?" Ethan leaned against his shovel. "You're Victoria Hale, CEO of a billion-dollar company. You make decisions every day that affect thousands of people. If you wanted to change how you operate, who's going to stop you?" "The board, the investors, the market, everyone who expects me to maximize profit above everything else." "And what do you expect from yourself?" The question hit Victoria like a punch. She opened her mouth to answer and found she didn't have one. What did she expect from herself? She'd spent so long meeting other people's expectations, her father's, the board's, the invisible judgment of everyone who said a woman couldn't build an empire, that she'd never stopped to ask what she actually wanted. Before she could formulate a response, Sophie burst out the door in her snow gear, cheeks pink with excitement. "Can we build a snowman, please? The snow is perfect for it." Ethan looked at Victoria, something shifting in his expression. "What do you say, Ms. Hale? You up for one more project?" Victoria looked at the little girl bouncing with anticipation, at the man who'd let her into his home despite every reason not to, at the sparkling expanse of snow waiting to be shaped into something new. "I'd like that," she said, and discovered she meant it more than she'd meant anything in years. They spent the next hour building a snowman, or rather, Sophie directed while Ethan and Victoria provided the muscle. The base needed to be bigger, the middle perfectly round, the head just right. Sophie produced a carrot from the kitchen for the nose, stones for the eyes, and insisted the snowman needed a scarf even though that meant sacrificing one of her own. "He'll be cold," she insisted when Ethan protested. "Everyone needs to be warm." So the snowman got Sophie's scarf, purple with sparkles, and somehow it was perfect. They stood back to admire their work. Victoria in her borrowed coat, Ethan with snow in his hair, Sophie dancing around their creation with pride. "We should name him," Sophie announced. "I think Frosty Jr." "Very original," Ethan said, but he was smiling. Victoria found herself smiling too, her cheeks aching from the cold and the unfamiliar expression. When was the last time she'd built a snowman? When was the last time she'd done anything just for the joy of it, with no agenda or expected return on investment? She couldn't remember. Sophie grabbed both their hands, pulling them into a circle around Frosty Jr. "We have to make a wish. That's what you do when you build a snowman." "I don't think that's actually a rule," Ethan said. "It is now. I just made it up." Sophie squeezed their hands. "Make a wish!" Victoria closed her eyes, feeling the small hand in one of hers and Ethan's larger, calloused hand in the other. The sun was warm on her face despite the cold. Somewhere a bird was singing. And for just a moment, standing in a circle in the snow with two people she barely knew, Victoria felt something she'd forgotten she was capable of feeling. Peace. When she opened her eyes, Ethan was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Something had shifted between them. Not forgiveness exactly, but maybe the possibility of it. The beginning of understanding. "Time for lunch," he said, releasing her hand. "Come on, monster. Let's get you warmed up." They trudged back to the cabin, shaking off snow, stamping feet. Sophie chattered about Frosty Jr. and whether he'd still be there tomorrow and could they build him a friend. Ethan listened with patient attention, answering each question seriously. Victoria followed them inside, pulling off the borrowed coat, and caught sight of herself in the small mirror by the door. Her hair was a mess, her face flushed with cold and exertion, her expensive makeup smudged and faded. She looked nothing like the perfectly composed CEO who'd left San Francisco yesterday. She looked alive. Lunch was grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup from a can, the kind of meal Victoria would have dismissed as pedestrian 6 months ago. Now, sitting at the small kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a warm bowl, she found herself savoring every bite. Sophie had insisted on cutting her sandwich into triangles because they tasted better that way, a logic Ethan didn't question. "Can Miss Hale see my room?" Sophie asked between mouthfuls, looking at her father with hopeful eyes. Ethan glanced at Victoria, something cautious in his expression. "That's up to Ms. Hale. She might not be interested in—" "I'd love to," Victoria interrupted, surprising herself. But the truth was, she was curious about this life Ethan had built, this small world that seemed to contain more warmth than her entire penthouse. Sophie grabbed her hand the moment they finished eating, pulling her toward the bedroom with the enthusiasm of a tour guide showing off a palace. The room was tiny, barely large enough for the twin bed pushed against one wall and a small dresser decorated with stickers. But every inch was filled with Sophie, dinosaur posters on the walls, a shelf overflowing with stuffed animals, drawings taped up everywhere showing families of stick figures and smiling suns. "That's me and Daddy," Sophie pointed to one particularly colorful picture. 2 figures held hands under a rainbow, one tall and one small. "And that's Mama watching from heaven." Victoria followed Sophie's finger to a smaller figure drawn in the corner, surrounded by stars and hearts. The casual way Sophie referenced her mother's death, like it was just another fact of her world, made Victoria's chest tight. "It's beautiful," Victoria said softly. "You're a wonderful artist." "Daddy says I get it from Mama. She used to draw too." Sophie pulled a frame from her bedside table, showing Victoria a photograph of a woman with dark hair and a bright smile, holding a baby Sophie. "That's her. She was really pretty." "She was," Victoria agreed, studying the photo. The woman looked young, happy, completely unaware that she had only a few years left. "Your daddy must miss her very much." "He does. Sometimes I hear him crying at night when he thinks I'm asleep." Sophie said it matter-of-factly, with the brutal honesty of childhood. "But he always makes pancakes in the morning, so I know he's going to be okay." The image of Ethan crying alone in this cabin, trying to hold himself together for his daughter, trying to rebuild their lives after losing everything, his wife, his job, his home, hit Victoria with almost physical force. She'd thought of the people she'd fired as numbers, as necessary sacrifices for the greater good of the company. She'd never once imagined them crying at night, struggling to comfort their children, measuring their emotional survival by whether they could still manage pancakes in the morning. "You take good care of your daddy," Victoria said, her voice rough. "He takes care of me," Sophie corrected, "but I try to help. I'm learning to make my own bed and everything." She demonstrated, pulling the covers up and smoothing them with serious concentration. The bed was far from perfectly made, lumpy in places, the pillow askew, but Sophie looked so proud that Victoria found herself smiling despite the ache in her chest. "You're doing a great job," Victoria said. "Your daddy is lucky to have you." "I'm lucky to have him too." Sophie flopped onto the bed, patting the space beside her. "Do you have a daddy?" Victoria sat carefully on the edge of the bed, the question pulling her back to memories she rarely accessed. "I did. He died a few years ago." "Did you cry?" "Yes, a lot." "That's good. Daddy says it's important to cry when you're sad. It lets the feelings out so they don't get stuck inside and make you sick." Sophie rolled onto her side, studying Victoria with those frank, assessing eyes. "Do you have anyone to make you pancakes?" The question was so innocent, so devastatingly perceptive, that Victoria had to look away. "No, sweetheart, I don't." That's sad. Sophie reached out and patted Victoria's hand with the same gentle gesture Ethan had used when comforting her. Maybe you could get someone. Everyone needs pancake people. Pancake people? The people who show up when you're sad and make sure you eat breakfast. Daddy says that's what love is, showing up with pancakes even when everything is terrible. Victoria's eyes burned. She blinked rapidly, trying to maintain her composure in front of this 6-year-old philosopher who'd just articulated something Victoria had spent her whole life avoiding. She'd built an empire, commanded boardrooms, been featured in Forbes and Fortune, but she had no pancake people. No one who would show up when everything was terrible and make sure she was okay. She had money, power, success, and she was utterly, completely alone. Sophie? Ethan appeared in the doorway, his expression gentle. Why don't you let Ms. Hale have some quiet time? I think we've overwhelmed her enough for one day. Sophie looked at Victoria's face and seemed to understand something beyond her years. She threw her small arms around Victoria's neck in a quick, fierce hug. It's okay to be sad, she whispered. Daddy says feelings are like weather. They change. Then she was gone, running back to the living room, leaving Victoria sitting on the edge of a child's bed in a cabin in the mountains, feeling more exposed than she had even when stripping off her wet clothes the night before. Ethan lingered in the doorway, not entering, but not leaving either. Sophie has a gift for finding the soft spots in people's armor. I'm sorry if she pushed too hard. She didn't. Victoria wiped at her eyes, not caring anymore about maintaining her executive facade. She's just honest in a way I've forgotten how to be. Kids are good at that. They haven't learned yet that honesty makes people uncomfortable. Ethan leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed. You okay? I don't know. Victoria looked around the small room at the evidence of a life built from love instead of ambition. I built my entire world on being strong, on never needing anyone, on making decisions based on logic instead of emotion. And now I'm sitting in your daughter's room, realizing that I've spent 15 years constructing the most elaborate cage imaginable. So, open the door. It's not that simple, Ethan. I have responsibilities, a company, thousands of employees depending on me to... She stopped, hearing how hollow it sounded. To what? Make them expendable when the numbers don't add up? Ethan's voice was quiet but firm. I'm not saying burn it all down. I'm saying maybe there's a way to run a company that doesn't require you to stop being human. And if there isn't, if the only way to succeed is to make the hard choices, the ones that hurt people, then you have to decide what kind of success you're willing to live with. Ethan pushed off the doorframe. My wife used to say that we're all writing our own eulogies with how we live. When you die, what do you want people to say about you? That you increased shareholder value? Or that you showed up with pancakes? He left before Victoria could answer, his footsteps soft on the hardwood floor. Victoria sat there in Sophie's room, surrounded by drawings and dinosaurs and the echoes of a child's wisdom, and forced herself to imagine her own funeral. Who would come? Her board members, probably. Business associates. Maybe some of the employees who'd survived her tenure. They'd say she was brilliant, strategic, a force of nature in the business world. And not one of them would cry. Not because they hadn't lost someone important, but because they'd never known her well enough to grieve the person, only the position. The thought was so bleak, so absolutely crushing, that Victoria had to stand up and move, needing to escape the confines of the room before she fell apart completely. She found Ethan in the living room, building up the fire while Sophie colored at the coffee table. I need to try to reach my office, Victoria said, her voice more controlled than she felt. Let them know I'm okay. Is there anywhere nearby with cell service? The main road, maybe, about a mile east. Ethan studied her face. You want me to come with you? No, I need... Victoria paused, trying to articulate what she needed. I need to walk, to think. Take the coat and the boots. Your stuff still isn't really dry enough for another trek. Ethan crossed to the window, checking the sky. You've got maybe 3 hours before the light starts to fade. Don't go past the main road. If you're not back by 4, I'm coming to find you. It should have felt like being managed, but instead it felt like being cared for. Victoria nodded, bundling back into the borrowed gear that was becoming familiar now. Sophie looked up from her coloring to wave goodbye, and Victoria waved back, feeling the strange pull of not wanting to leave this warm cabin even as she needed space to process everything crashing through her mind. The walk was harder than she expected. The path they'd cleared only went so far, and beyond that the snow was deep and fresh. Victoria pushed through it, focusing on the physical effort to quiet the emotional chaos. Her breath came in white puffs. Her legs burned. The borrowed boots were definitely too big, and she could feel a blister forming on her heel. She kept walking. The main road, when she finally reached it, had been plowed, though snow still lined both sides in dirty banks. Victoria pulled out her phone and watched it search for signal. 1 bar. Then 2. Then a flood of notifications that made her phone vibrate continuously for 30 seconds. 73 emails. 26 missed calls. 15 text messages. All marked urgent. All demanding her attention, her decisions, her time. Victoria stared at the screen, feeling the familiar pull of obligation. She should call her assistant, let the board know she was alive, check on the merger that was supposed to close Monday. She should step back into the role she'd spent 15 years perfecting. Instead, she scrolled through the messages, reading the subjects. Most were routine, things her team could handle without her. Some were important but not urgent. Only 3 actually required her input, and none of them required it in the next 24 hours. The world, it seemed, had not collapsed in her absence. Victoria typed out a single message to her assistant. Caught in storm. Safe but snowed in. Will be out of contact until tomorrow evening. Handle what you can, table the rest. VH. She hit send before she could second-guess it, then turned off her phone completely. The silence that followed was both terrifying and liberating. For the first time in 15 years, Victoria Hale was unreachable. The Empire would have to survive without her for a day. She stood on the side of the road for a long moment, watching the occasional car pass, knowing any of them would probably stop if she flagged them down. She could get a ride to town, find a hotel, return to her regular life, pretend the last 24 hours had been an aberration, a strange detour that meant nothing. But Sophie's question echoed in her mind. Do you have anyone to make you pancakes? And Victoria found herself turning back toward the cabin, toward the man who had every reason to send her away, and the child who'd offered her a purple blanket without hesitation. The walk back felt shorter, or maybe she was just more sure of where she was going. The sun was starting to sink toward the horizon, painting the snow in shades of gold and pink, beautiful and cold and temporary, like everything else. When the cabin came into view, smoke curling from the chimney, Victoria felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest. Not quite belonging, she hadn't earned that, but maybe the possibility of it. The sense that there might be other ways to measure a life than quarterly reports and stock prices. She was halfway across the clearing when the door opened and Sophie came running out, still in her indoor clothes, her face bright with excitement. You came back! Daddy said you would, but I wasn't sure. Sophie grabbed Victoria's hand, pulling her toward the cabin. Come see, I made you something. Inside, the cabin was warm and smelled like something baking. Ethan looked up from the kitchen, his expression showing relief he tried to hide. Get your call made. I did, and turned off my phone. His eyebrows rose. Voluntarily. Don't sound so shocked. I'm capable of unplugging. First time for everything. But he was almost smiling, and Victoria felt the tension between them ease another fraction. Sophie tugged her to the coffee table where a new picture was laid out. This one showing 3 figures building a snowman, carefully labeled with their names. Victoria recognized her own stick figure self by the triangle dress and the yellow scribbles that were probably meant to be her hair. That's us from today, Sophie explained proudly. I made it so you can remember. Do you like it? Victoria picked up the drawing, studying the careful details Sophie had put into it. The purple scarf on the snowman, the shovels in stick figure hands, even Frosty Jr.'s carrot nose. It was a moment captured in crayon and construction paper, a memory given form by a 6-year-old who thought the CEO who'd destroyed her father's life deserved to be included in the picture. I love it, Victoria said, her voice thick. Can I keep it? That's why I made it, so you won't forget us when you go back to your big important job. The assumption that Victoria would leave, would return to her regular life and forget this strange interlude, felt both reasonable and unbearable. Of course she would leave, of course she'd go back. That was how the world worked. But the idea of forgetting, of letting this slip away like it had never mattered, made Victoria want to fight against every practical impulse she'd ever had. "I won't forget," she promised, and meant it more than any business commitment she'd ever made. Ethan pulled something from the oven. Bread, fresh-baked and golden. "I should have asked if you have any dietary restrictions. I just assumed. I don't. And it smells amazing." Victoria realized she was hungry in a way that had nothing to do with actual physical need. She was hungry for this, for simple food shared with people who didn't want anything from her except her presence. They settled around the table as the winter light faded outside. Ethan sliced the bread, still warm, and served it with butter and honey. Sophie chattered about Frosty Jr. and whether snow people had feelings and if they got lonely at night. "Maybe we should build him a friend tomorrow," Ethan suggested, his eyes on Victoria. "If our guest is still here." "I am." Victoria heard herself make the commitment without consulting her calendar, her assistant, her endless list of obligations. "I'd like to be anyway. If that's still all right." "It's all right." Ethan's voice was quiet, but something in his expression had shifted. Not quite forgiveness, but maybe the beginning of understanding. "Actually, I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about wanting to see things clearly. And I think maybe I haven't been completely fair to you either. I've been angry, had every right to be, but I've also been judging you for making decisions I've never had to make. I don't know what it's like to run a company, to be responsible for that many people. Maybe there isn't an easy answer." "There isn't," Victoria agreed. "But that doesn't mean the answer I chose was the right one, or the only one." She broke off a piece of bread, watching the steam rise from it. "I've been operating on the assumption that business and humanity are fundamentally incompatible, that to succeed I had to be ruthless. But sitting here, watching you with Sophie, seeing how you've built a life out of basically nothing, it makes me question everything. We haven't built much." Ethan gestured around the small cabin. "This isn't success by your standards." "Maybe my standards are wrong." The words felt dangerous, like admitting to a fundamental flaw in her foundation. "Sophie asked me if I have anyone to make me pancakes, and I realized I've spent 15 years making sure I never need anyone for anything. I thought that made me strong. And now? Now I think it just made me alone." Sophie had been listening with the unself-conscious attention of a child who didn't know some conversations were supposed to be private. "You're not alone right now," she pointed out. "You're with us." "That's true." Victoria smiled at her. "I am with you. And tomorrow we'll build Frosty Jr. a friend, and then they won't be alone either." Sophie took this as settled fact. Everyone needs friends, even snow people. Ethan reached over and smoothed his daughter's lopsided pigtails, his touch gentle. "Even snow people," he agreed. "Even CEOs." They finished dinner as darkness settled over the mountains, complete and absolute in a way city darkness never was. No light pollution, no ambient glow from neighboring buildings. Just stars beginning to emerge, sharp and clear against the black sky. After Sophie was tucked into bed, with a story about brave velociraptors that Ethan made up on the spot, Victoria and Ethan found themselves back by the fire, the crackle and pop of burning wood the only sound. "I keep thinking about what you said," Victoria spoke into the quiet, "about writing our own eulogies, about how we'll be remembered. It's morbid, I know. Claire, my wife, she was like that. Always thinking about legacy, about what we leave behind." Ethan stared into the flames. "She knew she was dying for 3 months before it happened. Cancer they caught too late. And she spent that time making me promise things." "What kind of things?" "That I'd let Sophie know her. That I'd tell her stories, show her pictures, keep her memory alive. That I'd find joy again, even when it felt impossible. That I wouldn't let grief make me bitter." Ethan's voice was rough with emotion. "And that I'd teach Sophie to measure people by their kindness, not their success. To value showing up over achievement. She sounds like she was remarkable." "She was. And she would have hated what I've become these past 6 months. Angry, isolated, teaching Sophie that it's us against the world." Ethan looked at Victoria directly. "You showing up here? It's forced me to face some things I've been avoiding." "Like what?" "Like the fact that I've been using my anger at you as an excuse not to move forward. I've been so focused on what you took from me that I haven't been building anything new. I've been surviving, not living. And Sophie deserves better than a father who's just surviving. Victoria absorbed this, feeling the weight of her impact on this man's life from a completely different angle. She'd thought about the immediate damage, the lost job, the financial stress. She hadn't considered the secondary effects, the way her decision had rippled out to shape how Ethan saw the world, how he raised his daughter. "I don't know how to fix this," she said quietly. "I can't give you back the months you've lost. Can't undo the choices I made." "No, you can't. But maybe that's not what matters." Ethan leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe what matters is what we do from here. You can't change the past, but you can choose differently going forward. And if I don't know how, if I've spent so long operating one way that I don't know how to be different, then you learn. Same way Sophie's learning to make her bed, same way I'm learning to be both parents for her. You try, you fail, you try again." Ethan's smile was slight, but genuine. "No one expects you to become a different person overnight, Victoria. But maybe you could start by seeing the people in your company the way you're seeing Sophie and me right now, as humans with lives and losses and dreams, not just numbers on a spreadsheet." Victoria turned the idea over in her mind, trying to imagine conducting business that way, seeing each employee as someone's father, someone's daughter, someone who might be crying at night and measuring their okayness by whether they could still make pancakes in the morning. "It would be slower," she said. "Less efficient. The board would fight me." "Probably. But you're Victoria Hale. If anyone could pull it off, it's you. You have a lot of faith in someone who fired you." "No. I have a little bit of hope in someone who walked a mile in a snowstorm to find shelter, who colored with my daughter who's sitting here willing to admit she might have been wrong. That's not the same person who signed my termination papers without looking up." "How do you know I didn't look up?" "Did you?" Victoria closed her eyes, remembering that day. The stack of files on her desk, the board's directive ringing in her ears, the pressure to deliver results, to show strength, to never let them see her waver. She'd reviewed each file for 30 seconds, maybe 45, made a mark, moved to the next. Efficient, decisive, completely disconnected from the human cost of each stroke of her pen. "No," she admitted, "I didn't look up. And if you had? I don't know. Maybe nothing would have changed. Maybe I would have fired you anyway, because the number said I had to." Victoria opened her eyes, meeting Ethan's gaze. "Or maybe I would have seen something that mattered more than the numbers. I'll never know. But you'll look up next time." It wasn't a question, and Victoria found herself nodding before she'd consciously made the decision. "I'll look up next time." They sat in silence for a while, watching the fire burn down to embers. Outside, the wind had picked up again, but it was gentler now, more like the earth breathing than attacking. The cabin creaked and settled around them, comfortable in its age. "Can I ask you something?" Ethan's voice was careful. "What were you running from when you got in your car yesterday?" Victoria considered the question, the layers of answer beneath the surface response. "Burnout," my assistant said. "She practically forced me to take this weekend, said I was going to collapse if I didn't rest." "But that's not what you were running from." "No." Victoria pulled the blanket, Sophie's purple one, tighter around her shoulders. "I was running from the realization that I'd spent 15 years building something that doesn't actually make me happy. That I'd sacrificed everything personal for something professional, and I couldn't even say why anymore. The goalposts keep moving. First it was just survival, then success, then dominance. Now I'm supposed to expand into 3 new markets while increasing profit margins, and I can't remember what the point of any of it is. So stop. I can't just stop. I have responsibilities. To who? The board? The shareholders? What about your responsibility to yourself? To the life you're not living while you chase the next quarter's numbers?" Ethan's voice was firm, but not unkind. "I lost my wife. I know what it's like to realize you've run out of time to do the things you thought you'd get around to eventually. Don't wait for a crisis to force you to live differently." The words hit Victoria like cold water. She wanted to argue, to explain why it was more complicated than that, why she couldn't just walk away from everything she'd built. But the truth was simpler and more terrifying. She was afraid. afraid that if she stopped running, stopped achieving, stopped proving herself over and over, she'd discover there was nothing underneath. That her entire identity was wrapped up in being Victoria Hale, CEO, and without that title, she was nobody. "I don't know who I am without the company," she whispered. "Then maybe it's time to find out." Ethan stood, stretching. "I'm going to bed. You should too. Tomorrow we've got snow people to build, and Sophie's going to have us up early." He paused at the bedroom door, looking back at Victoria still curled in the chair by the dying fire. "For what it's worth, I think the person you are without the CEO title might be someone worth knowing. You just have to be brave enough to meet her." Then he was gone, leaving Victoria alone with the embers and the question she'd been avoiding her entire adult life. Who was Victoria Hale when she wasn't being powerful? She sat there long into the night, watching the fire burn down to ash, listening to the cabin breathe around her, and slowly, painfully, began to consider the possibility that she might want to find out. Victoria woke before dawn to the sound of Sophie's laughter filtering through the cabin walls, bright and clear as morning light. For a moment she lay still on the couch, wrapped in blankets that smelled like wood smoke and cedar, trying to remember the last time she'd slept past midnight. The answer came quickly. She couldn't remember. Sleep had become another thing she conquered through discipline. 5 hours exactly. Alarm set for 4:30 every morning so she could review overseas markets before her first meeting. But this morning she'd slept 7 hours, maybe 8, and her body felt different, rested, almost unfamiliar in its lack of tension. She sat up to find Ethan already in the kitchen, making coffee. He looked up when she moved, offering a small nod that felt less guarded than yesterday. "Morning. Sophie's been up since 5:30 planning the snowman's friend. I tried to get her to wait, but apparently the snow people can't be alone any longer, or they'll get sad." 5:30? Victoria glanced at the clock showing 6:45. "How are you even functioning?" "Practice. Claire used to say that having a kid was like boot camp for sleep deprivation." Ethan poured coffee into a mug, brought it to her. "You get used to operating on whatever hours they give you." Victoria accepted the coffee gratefully, noting again that he'd added cream without asking. Such a small thing, remembering how someone took their coffee. In her world, people had assistants for that, databases tracking preferences. But Ethan had just remembered, filed it away in the mental catalog of things he knew about the woman who'd fired him. Sophie bounded into the living room wearing mismatched socks and a sweater with a T-Rex on it. "You're awake. Good. We have a lot of work to do. Frosty Jr.'s friend needs to be a girl snowman, a snow lady. And she needs a hat because ladies need accessories." "Does she?" Victoria found herself smiling despite the early hour. "Everyone knows that." Sophie said it with the absolute certainty of childhood. "Can we use your scarf? The purple one from yesterday is on Frosty Jr., so we need a different color for his friend." "I don't have a scarf with me, sweetheart. Just what I was wearing when I got here." Sophie's face fell for only a moment before brightening again. "That's okay. We can make one from paper towels. Daddy, can we use the paper towels?" "For snowman, yes. For actual cleaning up, we're going to have a problem." But Ethan was already pulling out the roll, and Victoria watched the easy give and take between them, the way he set boundaries but made room for joy within them. Breakfast was oatmeal with cinnamon and brown sugar, another simple meal that somehow tasted better than the expensive brunches Victoria usually skipped. Sophie talked non-stop about snow lady construction, while Ethan listened with patient attention, occasionally interjecting practical suggestions about structural integrity that made his daughter roll her eyes. "Daddy's an engineer," Sophie explained to Victoria in a conspiratorial whisper that Ethan could definitely hear. "He thinks about boring things like whether stuff will fall down." "Boring things like making sure your snowman doesn't collapse are actually pretty important," Ethan said mildly. "Remember last year when you wanted to build one taller than the cabin? It would have been fine. It would have been a disaster. Physics matters, monster. Physics is boring. Physics is why you don't fall through the floor." Sophie considered this, then shrugged with the logic of someone who'd never had to worry about structural engineering. "Okay, but snow ladies don't need physics. They need hats." After breakfast, they bundled up again, Victoria in her borrowed coat and oversized boots that were becoming oddly comfortable. The morning was crystal clear, the sky so blue it hurt to look at directly. The sun turned the snow into diamonds, and Victoria had to squint against the brilliance of it all. Frosty Jr. stood exactly where they'd left him, Sophie's purple scarf bright against the white. Sophie ran to him immediately, checking to make sure he hadn't melted or lost his carrot nose overnight. "He's perfect," she announced. "Now we just need to make his friend." They spent the next hour rolling snow into spheres, Sophie directing the operation with the authority of a general commanding troops. The base needed to be bigger than Frosty Jr.'s, she insisted, because the Snow Lady was going to be the strong one in the relationship. Ethan caught Victoria's eye over Sophie's head, his expression amused and fond. "Where does she get these ideas?" Victoria asked quietly while Sophie packed snow around the base. "Her mother, mostly. Claire was very big on women being strong and capable. Sophie absorbed it all." Ethan paused, his hands still on the snowball they were forming. "Claire would have liked you, actually. She always said the women who made it in male-dominated fields had to be twice as smart and work 3 times as hard. She respected that, even when it came at a cost." "Did she work?" "Graphic designer, freelance. She could work from home, be there when Sophie needed her." Ethan's voice went soft. "She gave up a position at a big firm to do it. Said no job was worth missing Sophie's childhood for. I think about that a lot now. The choices she made, the things she prioritized." Victoria heard the unspoken question in his words. What was she prioritizing? What was worth the cost she'd been paying? They worked in silence for a while. The only sound Sophie's running commentary and the scrape of snow being packed and shaped. The physical labor felt good, purposeful in a way that signing documents never did. This was creation, simple and immediate. Roll the snow, pack it tight, stack the spheres. Watch something take form under your hands. When the Snow Lady was finally complete, smaller than Frosty Jr., but, as Sophie insisted, more elegant, they stood back to admire their work. Sophie had found stones for the eyes and smile, a stick for one arm positioned like the Snow Lady was waving. The paper towel scarf, carefully wrapped and surprisingly sturdy, fluttered in the gentle breeze. "She's beautiful," Sophie declared, "and now Frosty Jr. has a friend, so he won't be lonely." She grabbed both Victoria's and Ethan's hands again, pulling them into a circle around the Snow People. "We have to make another wish. That's very important for second Snow People." "I thought that was just for first Snow People," Ethan said. "No, it's for all Snow People. I'm the expert, Daddy. You have to trust me." Victoria closed her eyes, feeling the small hand in hers and Ethan's calloused one, the sun warm on her face despite the cold. What did she wish for? Yesterday she might have wished for the merger to close successfully, for the stock price to climb, for the board to approve her expansion plans. Today, those things felt distant, like concerns from someone else's life. Today she wished for something she couldn't quite name, the courage to change, maybe. Or the wisdom to know what needed changing, or just the grace to be present in this moment, in this circle, with these people who had every reason to reject her, and hadn't. When she opened her eyes, Ethan was watching her again with that same unreadable expression. But Sophie was already running circles around the Snow People, declaring them the best snow family in the entire world. "Can we take a picture?" Sophie asked, "so Ms. Hale can remember when she goes home?" The word home hit Victoria oddly. Where was home? The penthouse she barely lived in, filled with furniture chosen by an interior designer she'd met once? The office where she spent most of her waking hours? Neither place felt like what Sophie meant when she said home, a place with warmth and laughter and people who knew how you took your coffee. Ethan pulled out his phone. "Sure, monster. Let's get one with all of us." They positioned themselves between the Snow People, Sophie in front, Ethan and Victoria on either side. Ethan held the phone at arm's length, and Victoria found herself leaning in slightly, Sophie's shoulder warm against her side, Ethan's presence solid beside her. "Ditch. Say snow," Sophie commanded. "Snow," they chorused, and Ethan clicked the photo. He showed it to Sophie first, who squealed with delight, then offered it to Victoria. She looked at the image on the small screen and barely recognized herself. Her hair was loose and windblown, her face flushed with cold and exertion, her smile genuine and unguarded. She looked happy. She looked alive. She looked nothing like the carefully composed woman in her professional headshots. "Can you send that to me?" Victoria asked before she could think better of it. "Sure. What's your number?" She rattled it off, watching Ethan's eyebrows rise slightly when he recognized the area code. San Francisco, the same city where she'd fired him. The photo arrived moments later, and Victoria saved it immediately. This evidence that she'd been here, been part of this, been something other than a CEO for a few precious hours. They trudged back to the cabin, Sophie chattering about whether snow people could be friends with real people, or if that crossed some kind of boundary. Ethan fielded her questions with patience, occasionally throwing Victoria a look that suggested he found his daughter's philosophical inquiries both exhausting and delightful. Inside, warmth enveloped them again. Victoria was starting to understand the rhythm of it, the cold outside making the warmth inside more precious, the physical work making the rest more satisfying. It was a different kind of life than she'd known, measured in small cycles instead of quarterly reports. Hot chocolate? Ethan offered, already pulling out a pot. Sophie's convinced it's mandatory after snow construction. It is mandatory, Sophie insisted, climbing onto a chair. That's science. Pretty sure that's not science. It's Sophie science, which is better than regular science because it involves chocolate. Victoria found herself laughing, really laughing, the sound unfamiliar in her own ears. When was the last time she'd laughed like this? Not the polite chuckle she used in meetings, but actual laughter that came from somewhere deep and genuine? She couldn't remember that either. Ethan made hot chocolate the real way, melting actual chocolate and mixing it with milk and a pinch of cinnamon. He served it in large mugs with marshmallows that Sophie insisted on arranging in specific patterns before they melted. "Can I ask you something?" Victoria said as they settled around the table, Sophie blowing on her hot chocolate with intense concentration. "Why did you really let me in that night? You could have turned me away, told me to go back to my car. You would have been justified." Ethan was quiet for a long moment, his fingers wrapped around his mug. Sophie watched him with those perceptive eyes, sensing this was an important question even if she didn't understand all the context. "Couple of reasons," he finally said. "One, I'm not the kind of person who lets someone freeze to death on my doorstep, no matter who they are. Two, Sophie was watching, and I need her to learn that we help people even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. And three, Victoria prompted, sensing there was more. Three, I was curious." Ethan met her eyes directly. "I spent 6 months being angry at you, building you up in my head as this heartless corporate monster who didn't care about anything but profit. And then you showed up on my porch, soaking wet and desperate, completely vulnerable. I wanted to see who you actually were when you weren't behind your CEO desk. And what did you see? Someone who's been running so hard for so long that she forgot why she started running in the first place." His voice was gentle but honest. "Someone who built armor so thick she's suffocating inside it. Someone who maybe wants to be different but doesn't know how." Victoria felt the assessment like a diagnosis, clinical and accurate. "That's pretty damning." "It's honest, you asked." "I did." She took a sip of hot chocolate, using the moment to compose herself. "And you're right about all of it. I have been running. From what? I'm not even sure anymore. Failure, maybe. Weakness. The possibility that I'm not good enough, smart enough, strong enough to deserve what I've built. Nobody's good enough if that's the standard you're holding yourself to." Ethan's expression was understanding, not pitying. "We're all just doing our best with what we've got. The question is whether your best is taking you somewhere you actually want to go." Sophie had been listening, her hot chocolate forgotten. Now she piped up with the directness only children possessed. "Do you like your job, Ms. Hale?" Such a simple question. Such an impossible answer. "I used to," Victoria said slowly. "Or I thought I did. It made me feel important, powerful, like I mattered." "You matter without the job." Sophie said it like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "People matter because they're people. That's what Daddy says." "Your daddy is very wise." "I know," Sophie grinned. "He's the smartest daddy ever, except about making snow people bigger than the cabin. That was not smart." "Hey!" Ethan reached over to ruffle her hair. "That was your idea, not mine." "But you didn't stop me hard enough." They dissolved into gentle bickering, and Victoria watched them with something that felt almost like longing. This ease, this connection, This life built on showing up for each other. It was so far from anything she'd constructed for herself. She'd built an empire. They'd built a home. And she was starting to understand which required more courage. The afternoon passed in a lazy haze. Sophie demanded a rematch of their coloring session, producing more dinosaurs that needed attention. Ethan worked on his laptop for a while, freelance consulting that he handled from the cabin's small desk. Victoria found herself just existing, watching the light change outside the window, listening to the sounds of this small household, letting herself be still in a way she hadn't been in years. Around 4, Ethan made grilled cheese sandwiches for an early dinner. Sophie insisted on cutting them into dinosaur shapes, which resulted in some very strange-looking sandwiches, but delighted laughter from the 6-year-old. "I should probably check my car," Victoria said as they were cleaning up. "See if it's drivable. The road should be clear enough by now." Something shifted in the room, like everyone suddenly remembered this wasn't permanent. Sophie's face fell. "Do you have to go?" the little girl asked, her voice small. "Not tonight, but probably tomorrow." Victoria knelt down to Sophie's level, surprised by how much the thought of leaving hurt. "I have work I need to get back to. A whole company waiting for me." "But you just got here. We didn't even teach you how to make pancakes yet." Sophie's eyes were bright with tears she was trying to hold back. "And Frosty Jr. and his friend will miss you." "I'll miss them too. I'll miss you." Victoria found her own eyes stinging. "But I have to go back sometime." "Why?" Sophie asked with devastating simplicity. "Why do you have to go back to a place where you don't have friends, where nobody makes you pancakes? That doesn't make sense." "Sophie, that's enough." Ethan's voice was gentle but firm. "Ms. Hale has responsibilities. We can't ask her to stay just because we want her to." But Sophie wasn't ready to let it go. "She could have responsibilities here. She could help you with your computer work and help me with my reading, and we could build more snow people and—" "Monster." Ethan scooped her up, holding her close even as she protested. "I know you want her to stay. But some things aren't about wanting. Sometimes people have lives that pull them different directions." Sophie buried her face in her father's shoulder, her small body shaking with sobs that seemed too big for someone so small. Victoria stood there, helpless, watching this child cry over her departure and feeling like she was making the wrong choice even though it was the only logical one. Ethan carried Sophie to the bedroom, his voice low and soothing as he settled her down. Victoria could hear him talking about big feelings and changes and how sometimes people come into our lives for just a little while, but that doesn't make them less important. It was a lesson Claire had probably taught him when she was dying, preparing Sophie for the loss to come. Now he was using those same skills to prepare his daughter for Victoria's departure. The thought made Victoria's chest ache in a way she couldn't name. When Ethan emerged, he looked tired. "Sorry, she gets attached quickly." "Probably too quickly. I'm working on it with her, but 6-year-olds aren't great at emotional boundaries." "Don't apologize. I'm the one who disrupted your lives." "You showed up in a storm. That's not the same as disrupting." Ethan moved to the window, staring out at the darkening sky. "But she's right about one thing. It doesn't make much sense, does it? Going back to a life that makes you miserable. It's not that simple." "Why not?" "Because I have contracts and obligations and people depending on me, and none of that answers the question." Ethan turned to face her. "Why can't it be simple? You're the CEO. You make the decisions. If you want to change how the company runs, who's going to stop you?" "The board, the investors, the market. I told you this." "No, you told me those are the obstacles. That's different from them being able to stop you." Ethan crossed his arms, and Victoria recognized the engineer in him, solving a problem by breaking it down to components. What if you went back and actually made the changes you're thinking about? Saw employees as people instead of numbers? Built in flexibility and humanity instead of just efficiency? "I'd probably get fired." "Would you?" Ethan's challenge was gentle but real. "You're Victoria Hale. You built that company from nothing. You're the brand, the vision, the reason investors believe in Hale Technologies. They need you more than you need them. So what if you called their bluff?" Victoria wanted to argue, to list all the reasons it was more complicated than that, but the truth was simpler and more frightening. She was afraid. afraid of failing, of being wrong, of discovering that everything she'd built was built on a foundation that couldn't support the weight of actual humanity. "I don't know if I'm brave enough," she whispered. "You walked a mile through a blizzard in 3-inch heels." Ethan's smile was slight but real. "I think you're braver than you give yourself credit for." That was survival. This is choosing to dismantle everything I've built on the chance that something better might exist on the other side. Isn't that what survival is? Tearing down what doesn't work anymore and building something new? Before Victoria could answer, Sophie appeared in the bedroom doorway, her face blotchy from crying, but her expression determined. She walked straight to Victoria and held out a small stuffed dinosaur, a purple stegosaurus with button eyes. "This is Mr. Purple," Sophie said solemnly. "He's my favorite. I want you to take him when you leave so you remember us, and so you have a friend at night when you're sad." Victoria took the stuffed animal, its worn fabric soft from years of being loved. She looked at this child offering her most precious possession to a stranger, and something inside her cracked wide open. "Sophie, I can't take Mr. Purple. He's yours. But you need him more than me. I have Daddy. You don't have anyone." Sophie's logic was irrefutable and heartbreaking. "When Mama died, Daddy gave me Mr. Purple. He said he would keep me company when I was sad. Now he can keep you company." Victoria looked at Ethan, who had tears in his own eyes. He nodded, unable to speak. She knelt down and pulled Sophie into a hug, this small person who barely knew her but had seen straight through to the loneliness Victoria had spent 15 years denying. "Thank you," Victoria managed through her tight throat. "I promised to take very good care of him. And you have to tell him about your day. That's important. He likes to know things." Sophie pulled back, her small hands on Victoria's face. "And maybe you can come visit us? After you fix your company and make it nice like Daddy said? I'd like that very much." "Promise?" Victoria looked at this child, at her father standing behind her, at this cabin that had become more of a home in 2 days than her penthouse had ever been. She thought about the life waiting for her in San Francisco, the sterile apartment, the demanding schedule, the endless meetings with people who only knew her title, not her name. She thought about who she'd been when she arrived and who she was becoming in this space where pretense was impossible, and she made a choice that terrified her. "I promise. But Sophie, I need to ask your dad something first." Victoria stood, still holding Mr. Purple, and faced Ethan directly. "What you said before about coming back, making changes. What if I actually did it? What if I went back and rebuilt the company the way it should have been built from the start? With humanity at the center, not just profit." "I think that would be incredible," Ethan said carefully, "but also really hard. Would you help me?" The question hung in the air between them. Ethan blinked, clearly not expecting it. "Help you how?" "Come back to Hale Technologies. Not as employee number 347 in the engineering department, but as—" Victoria paused, the idea forming even as she spoke it. "As my chief people officer. Help me rebuild the culture, redesign how we treat employees, create systems that see humans instead of just productivity metrics." "Victoria, yeah, I know it sounds crazy. I know you have every reason to say no. But you understand what I destroyed in a way no consultant ever could. You know what's broken because you lived through it breaking, and you've shown me more about leadership in 2 days than I've learned in 15 years of being a CEO." Victoria's words came faster now, urgent with the need to make him understand. "I don't want to go back and pretend this didn't happen. I don't want to file this away as an interesting experience and return to business as usual. I want to actually change. But I can't do it alone." Ethan looked at Sophie, who was watching with wide eyes, then back at Victoria. "That's a big ask." "Big? I know. I'd have to think about it. Talk to Sophie. This cabin is our home now. We've built a life here." "I understand. And whatever you decide, I'll respect it. But Ethan?" Victoria clutched Mr. Purple tighter. "You were right about the eulogy, about what people will say when I'm gone. I don't want them to just talk about shareholder value. I want someone, somewhere to say, I tried to do better, that I showed up with pancakes, and I think maybe you're the person who can teach me how to do that." Sophie tugged on her father's sleeve. "Daddy, are we going back to the city?" "I don't know yet, monster. This is a big decision. We need to think about it carefully." But if we go back, will Miss Hale be our friend? Ethan smiled at his daughter, then looked at Victoria with an expression she couldn't quite read. Yeah, I think she would be. If we went back, I think Victoria would be our friend. The use of her first name, simple and direct, felt like a door opening. Not to the past, but to a future neither of them had imagined 2 days ago. Take the night, Victoria said. Think about it. Tomorrow I need to check my car. Probably head back. But Ethan? Whether you say yes or no, thank you for letting me in, for showing me what I'd lost, for giving me a chance to be different. You're welcome. Ethan's voice was soft. And Victoria? For what it's worth, I think you're going to do great things, with or without my help. But Victoria knew, standing there with a purple dinosaur clutched to her chest and a 6-year-old's faith in her ability to change, that she wanted it to be with. She wanted to learn from this man who'd survived her worst decision and somehow managed to show her grace anyway. She wanted to prove that people could change, that systems could be better, that success didn't have to come at the cost of humanity. She wanted to show up with pancakes. Sophie yawned, the emotional exhaustion of the day finally catching up with her. Ethan scooped her up again, and she didn't protest, just wrapped her arms around his neck and laid her head on his shoulder. Bedtime for you, monster. Say good night. Good night, Miss Hale. Don't forget to tell Mr. Purple about your day. I won't forget. Ethan carried his daughter to bed, and Victoria could hear him reading her a story, his voice low and soothing. She settled on the couch with Mr. Purple, this tangible piece of Sophie's heart that the child had trusted her with, and thought about tomorrow, about going back, about the choice she'd put in front of Ethan and the larger choice she'd put in front of herself. She could go back to San Francisco and continue as she had been, efficient, successful, alone. Or she could go back and actually fight for something different, knowing she might fail, knowing the board might push back, knowing everything might fall apart. But at least she'd be fighting for something that mattered. At least when she laid down to sleep, she'd have Mr. Purple to tell about her day, and the memory of a little girl who believed she could be better, and the hope that maybe, just maybe, she was brave enough to try. Victoria woke that final morning to the sound of Ethan already moving around the kitchen, the smell of coffee mixing with something sweeter. Pancakes, she realized. The irony wasn't lost on her. She sat up slowly, Mr. Purple still clutched in her arms from where she'd fallen asleep holding him, and allowed herself one more moment of being here, in this space, before the world came rushing back. Through the window, dawn was breaking clear and bright, the kind of morning that made promises about new beginnings, though Victoria had learned to be skeptical of promises made by weather. Still, there was something hopeful in the light, something that made her chest feel less tight than it had in months. Ethan looked up when she emerged, his expression unreadable. Coffee's ready, pancakes in 5 minutes. Sophie's still asleep, which is a miracle I'm not questioning. Ethan, Victoria started, but he held up a hand. Let me say something first before I lose my nerve. He set down the spatula, wiping his hands on a dish towel. I was up most of the night thinking about your offer, about what it would mean to go back, to work with you, to trust that you're actually going to follow through on changing things. Victoria's heart hammered against her ribs, but she stayed silent, letting him work through it. The thing is, I want to believe you. I want to believe that what happened here mattered, that you're not going to walk out of this cabin and go right back to being the person who fired me without looking up. Ethan leaned against the counter, his arms crossed. But I've been burned before, not just by you, by a whole system that treats people as disposable. So I need to know this is real. I need to know you're not just having a crisis of conscience that's going to evaporate the minute you're back in your corner office. I can't prove that to you, Victoria said quietly. Not with words. The only way to prove it is to actually do it, and that requires you to take a leap of faith I haven't earned. No, you haven't. He said it without malice, just fact. But Sophie believes in you. She told me last night that you have a good heart, but it's been hiding under your business clothes. And I've learned to trust my daughter's instincts about people. She's been right more often than I have. So what are you saying? I'm saying yes, but with conditions. Ethan poured 2 cups of coffee, handed her one. 1, I'm not moving back to San Francisco. This cabin is Sophie's home now, and I'm not uprooting her again. I'll work remotely, come into the office when needed, but our base stays here. Done. What else? 2. You give me actual authority. Not token diversity higher authority, not a fancy title with no power. If I'm going to help you rebuild the culture, I need to be able to make real decisions about how people are treated, how policies are implemented, how we handle everything from hiring to firing to family leave. You'll have it. You'll report directly to me with full budget authority and veto power on any personnel decisions. What's 3? Ethan smiled slightly. 3. You have dinner with us once a month. Here, at the cabin. Sophie insists, and honestly, so do I. If we're going to do this, I need to know you're staying connected to why it matters. Not just the business case, but the human one. No phones, no work talk unless it's about people. Just dinner and conversation, and remembering that we're all trying to figure this out together. Victoria felt something warm unfurl in her chest. Once a month. I can do that. And 4, Ethan hesitated, then pushed forward. You promise me that if you start falling back into old patterns, if the board pressure gets too intense, if you feel yourself choosing efficiency over humanity, you'll call me. Before you make the decision, give me a chance to remind you why you wanted to change in the first place. I promise. Victoria extended her hand. Do we have a deal, Mr. Cole? Ethan looked at her hand for a long moment, and she saw the war playing out behind his eyes. The hurt and anger from being fired, the cautious hope that things could be different, the fear of being disappointed again. Then he took her hand in his grip firm and warm. We have a deal, Ms. Hale. Victoria, she corrected. If we're going to do this, you should probably use my actual name. Victoria, then. He released her hand but held her gaze. Don't make me regret this. I'll do everything in my power not to. The pancakes were burning. Ethan swore and rushed to flip them, and despite everything, the weight of the decision they'd just made, the enormity of what lay ahead, Victoria found herself laughing. Real laughter, the kind that came from relief and joy, and the sheer absurdity of negotiating a life-changing business deal over breakfast in a mountain cabin. Sophie emerged right as the pancakes were being plated, her hair a disaster and her dinosaur pajamas on backwards. She took one look at the two adults and immediately sensed something had changed. Did you ask her, Daddy? I didn't ask her anything. She asked me. Sophie scrambled into her chair, eyes wide. And what did you say? I said yes. We're going back to the city. Victoria's going to give me a job helping make her company better for people like us. Sophie launched herself from the chair and threw her arms around Victoria's waist with such force that it nearly knocked her over. You're going to be our friend, a real friend, not just a storm friend. Victoria hugged her back, this small person who'd seen through all her defenses and decided she was worth saving. I'm going to be your friend, and you can come visit the office sometimes if you want. I bet the engineers would love to meet a future coder who already knows that fierce dinosaurs can be messy. Can I really? Sophie pulled back, her face glowing. Daddy, can I? We'll see. Let's eat breakfast before it gets cold and Victoria has to head out. They settled around the table and the pancakes were perfect despite Ethan's near disaster with them. Sophie insisted on chocolate chips arranged in a smiley face on Victoria's stack, a tradition that Victoria realized might become a monthly occurrence if she kept her promise about dinners. The thought didn't scare her the way it might have a week ago. Instead, it felt like something to look forward to, an anchor point in the chaos of corporate life, a reminder of what actually mattered. After breakfast, Victoria changed back into her own clothes, now fully dry but wrinkled beyond redemption. The Burberry coat looked worse for wear, the boots scuffed and salt-stained. She studied herself in the small bathroom mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back. Her makeup was long gone, her hair needed serious professional attention, and there were dark circles under her eyes from too many nights of deep conversation. She looked terrible. She looked real. She looked like someone who'd survived a storm and come out different on the other side. Ethan had already dug out her Tesla, the car looking almost absurd in this setting, too sleek, too expensive, too much a symbol of the world she was returning to. Victoria stood looking at it for a moment, keys in hand, feeling the weight of what came next. You okay? Ethan asked quietly, Sophie having run back inside to grab something she insisted Victoria needed for the trip. Terrified, actually. Victoria turned to face him. What if I get back there and I can't do it? What if the board fights me and I cave? What if I've been one way for so long that I don't know how to be different, even when I want to? Then you call me, like we agreed, and we figure it out together. Ethan's expression was serious, but not unkind. This isn't going to be easy, Victoria. You're going to face resistance. People are going to question your judgment, your leadership, maybe your sanity. But here's what I learned when Claire died. The hard path is usually the right one. Taking care of Sophie alone, moving here, rebuilding everything from scratch. All of it was hard. All of it was worth it. When do you want to start? At the office, I mean. Give me 2 weeks to get things organized here. I need to set up remote access, talk to Sophie's teacher about the new situation, make sure we've got a routine that works. Ethan paused. And Victoria, I'm going to push you. When I see something that needs changing, I'm going to say it. That's what you hired me for. I'm counting on it. I need someone who won't let me get comfortable with the status quo. Sophie burst out of the cabin carrying something wrapped in paper towels. She ran to Victoria and thrust it into her hands. I made you a breakfast burrito. Well, Daddy made it, but I wrapped it. So you have food for the drive and you don't forget to eat. Victoria accepted the burrito, still warm, and felt her eyes sting. Thank you, sweetheart. I promise to eat it. And you have Mr. Purple? Victoria pulled the stuffed dinosaur from her bag where she'd carefully packed him. Right here. He's going to have the best seat in the car. Good. He likes to see where he's going. Sophie hugged her again, fierce and tight. I'm going to miss you, but Daddy says you'll visit and we can video call too. He's going to teach me how. We absolutely can, and I'll send you pictures of Mr. Purple at the office. He's going to have adventures. Dinosaurs are good at adventures. Sophie pulled back, suddenly serious. Ms. Hale, Victoria, are you going to be brave? When you go back? I'm going to try my very best to be brave. That's all anyone can do. That's what Daddy tells me when I'm scared of new things. Sophie smiled, gap-toothed and radiant. You're going to be great. I just know it. Victoria knelt down to Sophie's level one last time. Thank you for sharing your home with me, and your dad, and Mr. Purple. You didn't have to be kind to me, but you were anyway. I won't forget that. That's what friends do, Sophie said simply, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Like forgiveness and grace were just natural responses to someone showing up desperate and cold. Maybe for some people, they were. Victoria stood, accepted a careful hug from Ethan that felt like a promise and a challenge all at once, and climbed into her Tesla. The interior felt foreign now, too luxurious, too removed from the real world. She set Mr. Purple in the passenger seat, propped up so he could see out the window like Sophie had instructed. Through the windshield, she could see Ethan and Sophie standing together in front of the cabin, his hand on her shoulder, both of them waving. Behind them, Frosty Jr. and his snow lady friend stood guard, witnesses to the transformation that had happened here. Victoria started the engine, programmed in her home address, and began the drive down the mountain. In the rearview mirror, the cabin grew smaller until it disappeared entirely. But the warmth of it stayed with her, a coal burning steady in her chest. The drive to San Francisco took 6 hours. Victoria ate the burrito Sophie had made, which was surprisingly good despite being wrapped in paper towels. She talked to Mr. Purple, feeling ridiculous but keeping her promise, telling him about the landscape changing as they descended from the mountains, about the thoughts churning in her head, about the plan taking shape for what came next. By the time she pulled into her building's parking garage, she had the first steps mapped out. Tomorrow was Monday. She had a board meeting scheduled for 10. Before that meeting, she was going to make some calls, set some things in motion, and stake her claim to the kind of leadership she wanted to provide. Her penthouse felt exactly as she'd left it, immaculate, empty, echoing. Victoria walked through it with new eyes, seeing it for what it was, a very expensive hotel room that no one actually lived in. The kitchen was pristine because she never cooked. The living room was magazine perfect because she never entertained. The bedroom was the only room that showed signs of habitation, and even that was sparse. She set Mr. Purple on her pillow, the bright purple dinosaur absurdly out of place among the gray and white minimalism, but he made the room feel less lonely somehow, a tangible reminder that she'd been somewhere real, with real people, and promised to be different. Victoria spent that evening doing something she'd never done before. She read through personnel files, not looking for metrics, but for people. She pulled up profiles of her employees and actually looked at them. Sarah Chen in marketing had 3 kids and was active in the PTA. David Rodriguez in engineering was working on his master's degree at night. Jennifer Wu in finance had been with the company for 8 years and never once taken more than 2 vacation days in a row. These were humans, people with lives and families and dreams that extended beyond their productivity scores, and she'd been treating them like interchangeable parts in a machine. The realization was devastating and necessary. Victoria made notes, questions to ask, policies to review, systems to dismantle. It was going to be a massive undertaking. The board was going to fight her. The investors were going to demand justification. She was going to face resistance from every direction. But she'd walked a mile through a blizzard in 3-inch heels. She'd survived the worst night of her life and come out better for it. She could do this too. Monday morning arrived with its usual demands. Victoria dressed carefully, choosing an outfit that felt like armor, but not a cage. A navy suit, yes, but softer than her usual choice. Professional, but approachable. She left her hair down instead of pulled back in its typical severe bun. Small changes, but they felt significant. She arrived at the office at 6:30 earlier than usual and immediately called her head of HR. "Margaret, I need you in my office. Now, if possible. We have some changes to implement before the board meeting." Margaret arrived 10 minutes later, coffee in hand and looking concerned. "What's wrong? Did something happen over the weekend?" "Everything happened over the weekend." Victoria gestured for her to sit. "I need you to pull the files on the 20% reduction we implemented 6 months ago. Every person we let go. Names, departments, circumstances." "Victoria, we can't rehire them all. The budget—" "I'm not asking you to rehire them all. I'm asking you to review them with me, case by case, and identify the ones we should never have let go in the first place. The ones where we prioritized metrics over circumstances. The ones where we failed to see the human cost of our decision." Margaret's expression shifted from concern to something like hope. "You're serious?" "Completely. And that's just the start. I want you to work with someone. He's going to be our new Chief People Officer. His name is Ethan Cole." "That name sounds familiar." "It should. We fired him 6 months ago." And Victoria watched Margaret's eyes widen. "He's going to help us rebuild our culture from the ground up. Flex time, family leave policies that actually support families, evaluation systems that account for circumstances beyond productivity. All of it. And Margaret, I need you to be honest with me. How much of our current system is actually working?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing how honest she could be. Then she seemed to make a decision. "Maybe 30%. The rest is bureaucracy and boxes we check to satisfy legal requirements without actually caring about the people behind them. I've been trying to tell you for years, but I didn't want to hear it because it would slow down our growth." Victoria finished. "I know. I'm listening now. What do we need to change first?" They spent the next 2 hours going through systems, policies, and procedures that needed immediate attention. By the time the board meeting rolled around, Victoria had a clear picture of just how much work lay ahead. She also had a plan, notes, and the conviction that came from knowing she was finally doing something right. The board meeting started exactly as she'd expected. Reviews of quarterly numbers, discussions of the merger, planning for the next fiscal year. Victoria let them go through their usual agenda, waiting for the right moment. It came when Richard Chen, the board chairman, asked about personnel optimization for the coming quarter. "Actually, I want to talk about personnel," Victoria said, her voice steady. "But not about optimization, about humanization." The room went quiet. 12 pairs of eyes fixed on her with varying degrees of confusion and concern. "I spent this weekend stranded in a snowstorm," Victoria continued, "and it gave me a lot of time to think about the decisions we've been making and the costs of those decisions that never show up on our balance sheets. We reduced our workforce by 20% 6 months ago. It looked good on paper, made our numbers attractive to investors, but we didn't account for what we lost: institutional knowledge, employee morale, trust in leadership, and we didn't see the human cost of those decisions because we didn't bother to look." "Victoria, this sounds like an emotional response to a difficult weekend," Richard said carefully. "Perhaps we should table this discussion until when? Until we've destroyed more lives in the name of quarterly growth? Until we've become so efficient that we've forgotten we're dealing with human beings?" Victoria pulled out her notes. I'm proposing a complete overhaul of how we handle personnel. Flexible work arrangements, enhanced family leave, evaluation systems that account for life circumstances. And I'm bringing on a chief people officer whose entire job will be to make sure we never again treat employees as disposable. The room erupted. Directors talked over each other, demanding explanations, questioning the financial impact, insisting this would destroy shareholder value. Victoria let them rage for exactly 2 minutes. Then she stood. I'm going to make this very simple, she said, her voice cutting through the noise. I built this company from nothing. My vision, my leadership, my reputation is why investors believe in Hale Technologies. And I'm telling you right now, we're going to do this differently, or I walk. The silence that followed was absolute. You're willing to resign over personnel policy? Richard looked genuinely shocked. I'm willing to resign over humanity, over treating people like they matter instead of like they're expendable, over building a company that doesn't require me to sacrifice my soul to run it. Victoria met each director's eyes in turn. I've spent 15 years doing things your way, making the hard decisions, prioritizing growth over everything else, and it's made us successful, and it's made me miserable. So yes, I'm willing to walk if you won't let me do this right. And if we call your bluff? This from James Morrison, the venture capitalist who'd been there since the beginning. Then you'll have to find a new CEO and explain to the market why Victoria Hale walked away from the company she built. Good luck with that. Victoria gathered her notes. I'm not asking for permission. I'm informing you of the changes I'm implementing. You can support them, or you can ask for my resignation. Those are your options. She walked out of the boardroom without waiting for a response, her heart hammering but her stride steady. She'd just bet her entire career on a principle, on the belief that there was a better way to do business. It was the most terrifying thing she'd ever done. It was also the most free she'd felt in 15 years. Victoria made it back to her office before her hands started shaking. She sat down heavily in her chair, the one she'd sat in for thousands of hours, making thousands of decisions that had led her here. Mr. Purple sat on her desk where she'd placed him that morning, a bright spot of purple in the sea of steel and glass. I did it, she told him. I actually did it. I don't know if it's going to work, but I did it. Her phone buzzed. A text from Ethan. How'd it go? Victoria stared at the message, realizing she must have told him about the board meeting yesterday, without consciously planning to keep him updated. The fact that he was checking in, that he cared enough to ask, made her eyes sting. She typed back, Ultimatum delivered. Either they let me change things or I walk. Currently waiting to see if I still have a job. The response came immediately. Proud of you. Sophie says Mr. Purple is proud too. Let me know what you need. Victoria clutched her phone, this lifeline to people who believed in her even when she wasn't sure she believed in herself. Whatever happened next, whether the board accepted her terms or asked for her resignation, she'd already won something more important than her position. She'd found her way back to being human. The next 2 hours were the longest of Victoria's life. She worked through emails, trying to focus on routine tasks while waiting for the verdict from the boardroom. Finally, her assistant buzzed through. The board would like to see you. Victoria walked back to the boardroom with her head high, ready for whatever came next. The directors were still there, looking various shades of thoughtful, concerned, and impressed. Richard spoke first. That was quite a performance, Victoria. It wasn't a performance. It was a statement of intent. We know. That's why we spent 2 hours discussing it. Richard leaned back in his chair. Here's what we decided. You get your chief people officer. You get to implement your policy changes. But you report back monthly on how it's affecting productivity, retention, and our bottom line. If the numbers tank, we revisit this conversation. And if the numbers improve, then you'll have proven that humanity and profitability aren't mutually exclusive. We'd all like to see that. This from James, who looked like the conversation had genuinely challenged some of his assumptions. For what it's worth, Victoria, I've watched you build this company for 15 years. I've never seen you this certain about anything. That counts for something. Victoria felt relief wash over her so strongly that she had to grip the back of a chair. You won't regret this. We better not. Because if this fails, you're not the only one who's going to face consequences. But Richard was almost smiling. Now get out of here and start this revolution of yours. And Victoria, whatever happened to you this weekend, I hope some of it sticks. I like this version of you better than the one who left Friday afternoon. Victoria returned to her office feeling lighter than she had in years. She called Ethan immediately. They said yes, she told him when he picked up. You're officially employed. Chief People Officer, reporting directly to me, full authority to make the changes we talked about. Victoria, that's amazing. She could hear the smile in his voice. How are you feeling? Terrified. Relieved. Like I just jumped off a cliff without knowing if there's water at the bottom. There's water, trust me. And even if there's not, at least you'll know you jumped because you chose to, not because someone pushed you. A pause, then. Sophie wants to talk to you. There was a rustling, then Sophie's voice came through, bright and clear. Victoria, did you tell Mr. Purple about your day? I did. I told him all about how I was brave because you told me to be. Good. Being brave is important. Daddy's going to make us pancakes to celebrate your new job for him. Can you smell them through the phone? Victoria laughed, really laughed. I don't think phones work that way, sweetheart. They should. Pancake smell is important. Sophie's voice turned serious in that way only children managed. I'm proud of you. That's what Daddy says when I do hard things. So I'm saying it to you. I'm proud of you for being brave. Thank you, Sophie. That means more than you know. Okay, Daddy wants the phone back. Bye. Don't forget to eat dinner, Ethan returned. Sorry about that, she insisted. Don't apologize. She's wonderful. You both are. Victoria looked around her office, seeing it differently now. I'm going to hold you to that monthly dinner, you know. I think I'm going to need it. We're counting on it. First one is in 3 weeks. Mark your calendar. Already done. They talked for a few more minutes about logistics, start dates, what Ethan would need to get set up. But underlying all of it was something warmer than a professional relationship, more solid than a business arrangement. They were building something together, not just a better company, but a different way of being in the world. When Victoria finally hung up, she sat for a moment in her office, Mr. Purple on her desk, the photo from the cabin set as her phone's wallpaper. In the picture, she stood between Ethan and Sophie, snow people flanking them, all of them smiling like they'd accomplished something important. They had. They'd proven that storms could strip away everything false and leave behind what mattered. They'd shown that people could change, could choose differently, could build something better from the wreckage of what didn't work. Victoria opened her laptop and started drafting an email to the entire company, not the usual corporate speak about strategic initiatives and optimization. Real words about real changes and why they mattered. She wrote, I've spent 15 years building this company on the principle that success requires sacrifice of time, of relationships, of humanity. I was wrong. Starting today, we're going to operate differently. We're going to see each other as whole people, not just productivity metrics. We're going to build in flexibility, grace, and the understanding that we all have lives outside these walls that matter just as much as what happens inside them. She went on to introduce Ethan, to outline the coming changes, to invite feedback and partnership in rebuilding their culture. It was vulnerable in a way corporate communications never were. It was honest about failure and hopeful about the future. It was the kind of email Victoria would have deleted as too emotional just a week ago. Now, she hit send and watched it go out to 3,000 employees, each of them a person with a life and a story and a reason for showing up every day. She didn't know if they'd believe her, didn't know if the changes would work, or if she'd face more resistance than support. But she knew she'd tried, knew she'd looked up this time, seen the people behind the numbers, and chosen to do better. That night, alone in her penthouse, Victoria made herself dinner for the first time in months. Just pasta and sauce from a jar, nothing fancy. But she set the table, lit a candle, and ate slowly instead of scarfing food while answering emails. Mr. Purple sat in the chair across from her, and she told him about her day like she'd promised Sophie, about the board meeting, about sending the email, about the responses already flooding in, some skeptical, some grateful, all of them surprised that Victoria Hale was suddenly talking about humanity instead of quarterly targets. After dinner, she called her assistant and did something she'd never done before. I need you to block out the first Monday evening of every month. Personal commitment, non-negotiable. What should I tell people who want that time? Tell them I have a standing appointment to remember why any of this matters. Victoria smiled, thinking of pancakes and snow people and a little girl who believed in her. Tell them I'm having dinner with friends. 3 weeks later, Victoria drove back up to the cabin with her trunk full of groceries and Mr. Purple riding shotgun. The mountain road was clear now, spring already starting to melt the snow. The cabin looked smaller in daylight without the drama of a storm, but no less welcoming. Sophie saw her car first and came running, Ethan following at a more sedate pace. Victoria barely had time to get out before she was wrapped in a fierce hug from the 6-year-old. You came! You really came! Daddy said you would, but I was worried maybe your important job would be too important. Nothing's more important than this, Victoria said, and meant it completely. They spent the evening making dinner together, Ethan teaching Victoria the basics of cooking, while Sophie provided running commentary on everything they were doing wrong. They ate around the small table, talking about the changes at the company, about Sophie's progress in coding, about the snow people who'd finally melted, but left behind their accessories as proof they'd existed. After dinner, Sophie fell asleep on the couch between them, exhausted from the excitement. Ethan carried her to bed, and when he returned, he and Victoria sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire burn down. It's working, Victoria said quietly. The changes. Productivity is actually up because people aren't burning out. Retention is improving. The board is cautiously optimistic instead of actively hostile. Of course it's working. Turns out treating people like humans makes them want to work harder, not less. Who knew? Ethan's tone was dry but affectionate. You did. Sophie did. I'm the one who had to learn it the hard way. The hard way was the only way you were going to learn it. Some lessons don't stick unless they cost you something. Ethan looked at her seriously. Are you doing okay? Really? Victoria considered the question. She was working just as hard as before, maybe harder. But she was also eating regular meals, sleeping better, taking Sundays completely off. She'd started saying no to commitments that didn't serve her values. She'd begun building actual friendships instead of just professional networks. She was different. Not perfect, not transformed overnight, but genuinely, measurably different. I'm doing better than okay, she said. I'm doing well. Maybe for the first time in my adult life. Good, because Sophie's already planning next month's dinner. Apparently we're going to make homemade pizza, and you're going to help with the dough. I'm terrible at cooking. I know. She thinks it's funny to watch you struggle. Ethan smiled. Welcome to having actual friends, Victoria. We're going to make you do uncomfortable things and laugh about it. I think I can live with that. She drove home that night with a container of leftovers, a new drawing from Sophie for her refrigerator, and the warm feeling of belonging somewhere, of being part of something that mattered, not because it generated revenue or pleased investors, but because it was real. The months that followed weren't easy. There were setbacks and resistance, moments when Victoria questioned whether she'd made the right choice. But every time she wavered, she'd look at Mr. Purple on her desk, or the photo of the snow people on her phone, or the monthly calendar reminder about dinner at the cabin. She'd remember that she'd survived a storm by letting someone help her, that she'd learned what mattered by having everything stripped away, that the strongest thing she'd ever done wasn't building an empire. It was choosing to tear down the walls around herself and let people in. A year after the storm, Victoria stood in front of the company at their annual meeting and told them a story. Not about growth metrics or market dominance, but about walking a mile through a blizzard in inappropriate shoes and finding shelter with the man she'd wronged. About learning that true strength wasn't about never needing anyone, but about being brave enough to admit when you were wrong and humble enough to change. The employees stood and applauded, not for her success, but for her honesty, for admitting she'd failed them and working every day to do better. Ethan stood in the back of the room, Sophie on his shoulders so she could see. When Victoria's eyes found them, Sophie waved enthusiastically, and Ethan nodded with quiet pride. That night, Victoria returned to her penthouse, which now had actual furniture people could sit on, art on the walls, and a kitchen that showed signs of regular use. She made herself dinner, set the table, and told Mr. Purple about her day like she did every evening. She was Victoria Hale, CEO of a billion-dollar company, leader of 3,000 employees featured in Forbes and Fortune. She was successful and powerful and respected. But more importantly, she was someone's friend, someone's partner in building something better. Someone who showed up for dinner once a month and struggled with pizza dough and didn't have all the answers. She was someone who'd learned that the storm doesn't break you if you're willing to ask for shelter. That power means nothing if you're too afraid to be vulnerable. That the greatest legacy you can leave isn't on a balance sheet. It's in the lives you've touched, the kindness you've shown, the moments when you chose humanity over efficiency. She was someone who'd finally learned that success isn't measured in quarterly reports, but in whether you have people who'll make you pancakes when everything falls apart. And for the first time in her carefully constructed life, Victoria Hale was exactly who she wanted to be.